Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. Thank you for creating this time to join us during this session on our Blue Academy. And as we start off, my name is Mercy Amai, a young professional working with the World Bank in the Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy Department, the PROBLUE. And to start off, we'll have our speakers. I'll introduce them. Nuru Lama, thank you for joining us, is the Chief Investment Officer with the Global Energy Infrastructure at IFC, with over 2 decades of energy sector with experience at the World Bank and the private sector. Nuru currently leads and coordinates the power generation practice at IFC, with a primary focus on growing renewable energy business across emerging markets. Alongside him is Christian Peter, joining us virtually, is the Practice Manager, Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy Global Practice at the World Bank. He has 30 years experience of working in the environment, conservation and management of the natural resources. He has held various headquarter and field-based operational positions as the environment, natural resources and management specialist in Africa, Latin America and Caribbean, as well as the East Asia and Pacific region. So thank you for joining us. I invite you, both of you, to give us an opening conversation remark. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm really happy that this could finally take place, and this is also great that we have this in the framework of what we call the Blue Academy. So talking about offshore wind in emerging markets and the environmental and social sustainability is really an exciting piece, and I think particularly exciting because it brings together the World Bank Group as a whole. So environment, natural resources, blue economy, the energy global practices together with IFC to really work on this topic. And I do think that while we were sort of thinking about how we make this a little bit more interactive, I have to apologize that I missed the point that I was supposed to be in the office, which I am not. Joining, so we try to make this work, and I'm really looking forward to these conversations, and would like to invite Nuru to also make some quick remarks.
Thank you, Christian. Glad to be here at this PROBLUE's Blue Academy to have this discussion on how we advance offshore wind in emerging markets. It's an area of focus at IFC in terms of really, both in terms of scaling up on clean energy, but also on energy transition. We have an excellent partnership going on right now with ESMAP, World Bank, and IFC on the offshore wind development program. I've seen it in action, including recently in Copenhagen, where there was the Wind Europe conference. So glad to be here and glad to have this conversation.
Great. So what we try to do is really to sort of have a little bit of question and answer game between Nuru and I. So let me ask the first question. Nuru, from your perspective, what's the unique or what's the innovation about this partnership between the bank and IFC? And are there any other successful partnerships that we can build upon to really make this a success?
Yeah, so World Bank IFC has been collaborating on a number of things. When I think about climate and renewables, if I think about lighting Africa or scaling solar or scaling wind, there have been a number of these engagements. But I think on offshore wind, it really is quite different in terms of the scale and the size of the opportunity and the complexity. So let me focus a bit more on that. When I talk about scale and the sheer ambition around offshore wind, you know, there's around or over 50,000 megawatts of offshore wind that's been installed globally. But pretty much all of that has been in Europe and in China. So when we talk about emerging markets, we're really barely scratching the surface right now. A lot of work has already been done in terms of trying to advance in a number of countries like Philippines, Vietnam, Turkey, India. But these are initial steps that the program is undertaking, and we have had good interest and success in terms of really building up interest and government buy-in for offshore wind. But in terms of really the scale of opportunity and the scale and the opportunity to really transform clean energy delivery and energy transition, and globally, we're not talking about one region. Globally, I think it's just so different. And so, when I mentioned 50,000 megawatts, mind you, in terms of the cost, 1 gigawatt of offshore wind project costs around $3 billion. So here we're really talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions, if I look at the next 10, 15 years in terms of the investment needs and the opportunity in emerging markets. So quite a lot for us in really, what we can do in emerging markets. Now, let me get to the second point on complexity. Offshore wind is not just complex in terms of construction, out in the sea. So yes, technically it's complex, but it's also about the entire ecosystem of offshore wind. You need ports, you need vessels, you need strong grid infrastructure to react with the power. So we're not just talking about building the offshore wind project, but it's the entire ecosystem, and that really requires strong public and private partnership because governments are involved, local stakeholders are involved, the private sector is involved. And that's where I think this program also, really delivers well because of the complexity. You have to really get involved in project development, in offshore wind planning from very early on. And even when we're looking at governments like the Philippines or Vietnam, offshore wind is new to them. And so for us, building that expertise, sharing that expertise really is quite key. And I think that's what the program is really trying to do from the very get-go, to really work together and bring, the sum of the parts, which is really, bigger as a whole, much bigger. So that's what the program is trying to do, and it's much needed. So I think that's in that sense quite different from the other partnerships we have done. And I can see that in terms of government interest, again, good work has already been done in places like Philippines, Vietnam, but also now there are a number of governments actually coming to the program saying, hey, we are interested. How can we work with you? Because this is a great opportunity for us. So with that, back to you, Christian.
Yeah. So I think what for me was very important, what you said, is that it needs to be embedded in sort of the entirety of a system. And I think, therefore, it's also important to think about trade-offs. And it's therefore also important to think about how can we sort of make sure that our efforts to address climate change, but at the same time also to care about biodiversity loss or the loss of nature and the ecosystem services, that we really need to sort of be aware that these different shifts in either crisis are reinforcing, compounding, and contributing in other ways that can cause losses to the economics or the economic development of a country, and also to the well-being. So I do think that it is also important when we look at these investments that the key natural ecosystems really need to be taken care of. And I think it's important to look at this from a spatial lens so that we have explicit information that decision makers can act upon, and focusing on not only the climate change impacts and also to how to mitigate those climate change impacts, but also pairing this with information about location, state, and trends, and particularly the communities who live off and depend on these coastal and marine ecosystems. And therefore, I think it will be important to sort of integrate, bake in to some extent, good economic, environmental and social practices into our recommendations to government, and really sort of have clear roadmaps. So in this respect, what we're doing on our side is to support the adoption of marine spatial planning. That really is a tool to transition to a blue economy, but in a sustainable blue economy, and address the dual challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. So we're taking into account that marine spatial planning can provide a framework for managing the social, but also the economic and environmental tensions. And it can do so by including a broad range of stakeholders in participatory mapping, decision-making processes, so that it really looks at reducing investment risks and improves investor confidence. And at the same time, coming back to what I said earlier, is really sort of to look at how it can identify trade-offs and synergies between these different plans and help making sure that investments across marine sectors, the data sharing, the capacity building, and the institutional strengthening are all sort of developed as part of a process that is not, and we have a conversation with some of our donors looking at sustainable ocean plans. And for me, a plan is usually a document that ends up in a shelf. And I think while we in ENB, at least, we're really focusing on the planning as a process that needs to be really moved forward and really help to integrate this. Over to you, Nuro.
So fully agree with you, Christian. And when I look at the IFC operations in the renewable space, if I look at onshore wind, offshore wind, we haven't yet invested, but on the onshore side, we have done around 6 gigawatts of projects over the last few decades. And it's clear to us that really you have to factor in environmental social considerations upfront into the project design at the early stage in the concept, because trying to avoid risk or trying to proactively mitigate risk upfront, it's so much better from so many different perspectives than trying to address them much later on down the road. And if you don't address it upfront, mistakes will be made. And once mistakes are made, we know how difficult it is to really correct them. And on the IFC side, we've had to, when we look at some of these projects, because we're not involved upfront, on the onshore sides, we are in some cases, and in some cases we are not. When the project just comes for us to finance them, sometimes we have to let go of the project because, from an environmental social perspective, it's just not tenable. So, for that reason, really the program prioritizes environmental social consideration upfront in the project design. And when the program is working with the government, with private developers, really we try our best to take into consideration the environmental and social considerations. So we do look at, like you're mentioning, on early stage sort of spatial planning. We do look at social aspects and look at who are the key stakeholders, what are the initial assessment on impact, and how can that be addressed. So all those considerations are taken into factored in by the program. And I think that's, again, quite important in the offshore wind space because the project development cycle is fairly long. It's very resource intensive. It's capital intensive. So, the last thing you want to do is discover that there are fairly major environmental social issues, 3 years, 5 years into the program, right? So I think governments and private developers appreciate that quite a lot. We saw this actually, I mentioned Wind Europe conference in Copenhagen, and really there was such a big focus on biodiversity. And the Wind Europe conference, by the way, was, I would say, pretty much focused on offshore wind, not on onshore this time around. So, there's a lot of excitement around offshore wind, but also equally, I think developers, governments, other stakeholders all realize how critical it is to really look at biodiversity issues, and look at social issues upfront. And I think, if you look at even the industry in Europe, you've seen that there's been a lot of development, but at the same time, we have seen that fishing communities have at times expressed concerns about the impact that it might have on their livelihood. We have had conservationists also, express concern around, impact on birds, and bats, and marine mammals. So I think, there's recognition in the industry that we really have to address these things, and that's front and center of the program design. for us on the offshore side.
Great, yeah, and I think just sort of to round this all up, I do think what also is important for us is to take into consideration sort of what we have done so far. We really have tried to sort of bring what we call blue economy onto the map, and I think we really have achieved it to a point that we're now struggling as an environment and natural resource and blue economy global practice to really have the climate co-benefits, since some of the activities we're doing in the blue economy, such as fisheries, don't really have a methodology. So while we're really building up, scaling up these programs, we're facing a different set of activities. But I do think that in this particular sector, really looking at sort of the space as a whole and working throughout the different institutions within the World Bank Group will definitely make these programs better. And I see that Lori is also going to speak later today and is also in the room. Really would like to make this point that we are currently in the process of looking at what are nature positive investments that we can actually work towards, and we're working on a taxonomy, we're working on a methodology in really looking at to identify these different things. And while nature positive may be a very long stretch for us as an institution, but there are mainstreaming of nature positive investments, and which we're really on nature investments and nature finance, which we're really looking forward to. And I think we can only do this as a World Bank Group together, also with MIGA, who is also part of this work, and really collaborate, because I think there are different bits and pieces that each of the individual institutions can bring to the table. And I think only as a whole will we actually make the contribution towards what we really want to achieve. And I think the example of this particular work now in this partnership can really help us to move the needle in this direction.
If I look at, for example, we were looking at Vietnam and the opportunity to develop offshore wind there. Early on, we spotted that there are some biodiversity concerns that really had to be managed. Similarly in a number of other places, I think, again, really early engagement is a key factor in terms of how we progress on opportunities. And, again, there are sensitive areas that we want to avoid. There are other areas that may not be as sensitive, but there might be other risks that need to be mitigated. And so really from a project planning perspective, these we want to take care of. And then, we also want to not just look at the project that we're trying to finance, right, or develop. It's really about the overall area, about cumulative impact. And that's an area of focus we have with the program, but in general at IFC, and we focus a lot. Just to give an example, in Jordan, when we were doing onshore wind, with the Jordanian government, we launched a cumulative impact assessment of the Tafila region, where there were a number of wind projects being developed. And that really helped in terms of government planning of the location of wind projects in the country. Similarly, on hydro projects, we look at cumulative impact in the river basin when we do projects. And that's all important in not just for that project, but overall in terms of the sector development. And for me also, it's really about sustainability. And when I think about sustainability, it's environmental, social sustainability for sure, but it's also about commercial sustainability. It's about technical sustainability. And so we look at all of those factors, from a commercial standpoint, does the project make sense? Is it cost competitive for the country? Does the country need that power? From a technical perspective, are we working with experienced sponsors, project developers, contractors, equipment suppliers? All that is important. And for us, again, and of course, environmental, social sustainability, we discussed that. And really, sustainability to us is not just a buzzword. It's it's ingrained in how we look at environmental social considerations. In fact, sustainability is sort of the driving framework. It's what drives the IFC environmental social standards. And these standards are not just a matter of compliance for us, it's also environmental social things that we really deeply care about. And more importantly, also environmental social standards for us. Our standards are adopted by the international financing community. And so, even from a project developer perspective, it's quite critical for them to look at environmental social considerations, because you don't want to, again, spend tens of millions of dollars developing a project. And then when you come to the lenders say, hey, are you compliant with the IFC social and environmental standards? And if you're not, well, you have a major problem, right? So, and so purely from a commercial standpoint too, there are real reasons why developers need to focus on environmental social standards and risk upfront. So again, I want to also say that Christian, that PROBLUE has been a big supporter of the program. So we thank and appreciate that support. And again, as we look at different countries, different opportunities, that partnership will be quite important, because there's a lot of work to be done still.
Yeah, thanks, Nuru. And I think this is really what this is about. And I think this is only, I guess, as an initiation or a beginning of a conversation. We have already shown that we can collaborate. So let's see how we can sort of learn from these experiences. And so I think this space, which we're now having today, is a possibility to dive deep into some of these issues and really tease out what has worked, what hasn't worked. And I'm looking forward to sort of what comes out of this and hopefully hear back from this soon. So thanks. Over to you, Amai.
Thank you so much, Christian and Nuru, for really highlighting the key aspect and the partnership that is working between the World Bank and IFC in addressing the challenges as well as the opportunities in the emerging markets. And this has been a great job opening this session with other speakers, and we'll follow up those conversations to address the issue that has been highlighted. Thank you. We're following up with the agenda, and through the opening remarks, we have a very exciting speaker that will be highlighting key issues that have been mentioned. And to introduce you to the event, this is the fourth module of the Blue Academy. This is a training program that is supported by the PROBLUE, which is offered by the World Bank to the staff members and also external experts in this area. We support the Blue Economy Tools activities, and in this module, we have had partnership in the program with the World Bank Group Offshore Wind Development Program, led by Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, ESMAP, and the International Finance Corporation, as well as the OLC. And therefore, in this session, we'll be focusing on the PROBLUE Pillar 3 on Blue Ocean. As we have seen as we are signing up, is the environmental and social sustainability of offshore wind in emerging markets. To the participants, we are having a very great program. We'll be having two speakers opening up on the overview of the global offshore wind, as well as giving us the aspects and the principle of the sustainability. Then later, this will be followed by a first panel discussion on the spatial planning to inform us on the impact, risk, and the costs for developing this offshore wind sector. Later, we'll have a demo to visualize and give us a better understanding on how we can scale up this, and therefore it will give us a practical view on how this theory and the aspects we're talking can be done. And then lastly, we'll have a panel discussion just to give us more discussion on the offshore wind benefits, impacts, and mitigation. And with all this, we have great speakers lined up. Kindly, for those who are in the room, we won't have a break since we have a very tight schedule, and therefore we're encouraging you to help yourself with the coffee outside. For those who are joining us virtually, you need the coffee, kindly grab the best beverage that will ensure that we remain clean throughout, and we become experts so that we become the advocacy on this area of emerging market. To the online participants, we're requesting you to stay muted, and since we have a very tight schedule, kindly, if you have any question, put it on the chat, and wherever we have time to answer them, we will. For those that we won't have, we'll ensure that the speakers respond to them as we continue this conversation even after this Blue Academy. After that, I want to introduce our first speaker, Mark Lebon. He's the Senior Energy Specialist in Offshore Wind in Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, that is ESMAP in the World Bank, and co-leads a World Bank Group Offshore Wind Development Program. He's working in the offshore wind sector, and for the past 15 years, he's been an expert in this sector, having advised both government and project development in over 20 countries. Prior joining the bank, he worked with the international consultancy firm, leading an engineering and environmental advisory team on design and planning of the offshore wind project. Mark will be giving a presentation in the next 15 minutes. And for the audience, put your question. We will have 5 minutes for the session to answer all the questions that will pertain Mark's presentation. So Mark, sorry, please.
Thank you, Amai. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Laborn, and I co-lead the Offshore Wind Program. We've had a really interesting conversation over between Nuru and Christian. There were some really important points that were raised, and a lot of points to pick up on in the rest of this session. I'm going to start by looking at the program. We've already heard a bit about the Offshore Wind Program in the World Bank Group, but I'm going to just delve into that, give you a bit more background and context to the program and why we're doing it. But I thought I'd start out with the question of why offshore wind? Why are we doing this? Why are we interested in offshore wind, and what is it? This is a technology that really has evolved over the last 30 years, and in the last probably 10 years where we've seen drastic change and shift in the technology, its maturity and its cost. It is large scale. We've already heard from Nuru saying that it's very complex. It is. It's expensive. It's difficult. But the rewards are great. You get very large-scale projects, high output, often much higher output than onshore renewables, which makes it a lot easier to integrate into the grid, and can be a very important part of a future decarbonised energy mix. But the reasons why the governments choose to do offshore wind are varied. I think every country that we work with and we've seen have had different drivers as to why they're doing offshore wind. Predominantly, there are two. One is clearly power, renewable power, but the second is economic benefits, whether that be benefits to local communities on the coasts, to fishing communities that may be in decline, or to manufacturing, to revitalising ports and shipbuilding. There's a lot of different drivers to why governments decide to do this. But we've seen this can work as part of any sort of scenario that the governments come up with, but they need to have clear planning as to why they're going to do it, and a clear vision from the governments to what they want from the sector. Perhaps I could also say that there is a lot of space offshore, and there is a big opportunity there. But there are many, many users of the sea. Stakeholders are very different to what we see onshore. And in this picture here, you can see shipping lanes in between two offshore wind projects. And that is just one of the many stakeholders that you need to consider as part of planning an offshore wind project. And we'll hear quite a bit more about that today as we look at spatial planning and how to mitigate impacts. Just to give you an example as to where we are at the moment. The industry started about 30 years ago, in the early 1990s in Denmark. Very small scale projects, just a few here and there over the first decade or so. And I said in the last 10 years, we've seen quite a large ramp up. We're now over 64 gigawatts. So that's, let's say it's over 10,000 turbines installed globally across the world in 19 countries. But if we look to the future as to where we're going, we've had projections from the IEA and IRENA looking at net zero for the globe and what contribution offshore wind would need to make. And they've both estimated that we need over 2,000 gigawatts by 2050 for the globe to meet its net zero targets. We also had the ORIAC panel, which came together under the UN a couple of years ago, which was led by the industry and other stakeholders. They came out with a vision of 1,400 gigawatts. But clearly, that take either of those is still quite a long way to go. If you look at where we're at with current global policy commitments, you look at adding up all the targets we've got globally at the moment, we've got over 300 gigawatts by 2030. Now, given that it's taken us 30 years to get to 64 gigawatts, it's going to be quite a tall order to get to 300 gigawatts, but the industry is gearing up and there's a lot of optimism and this is a huge opportunity to deliver the technology. If we look globally though, here, if you look at any color that is orange or red or purple, that is considered viable for offshore wind. So anything that's 7 meters a second and higher, these wind speeds will likely give you an economically viable offshore wind project. And the colored countries here are the countries that have either installed offshore wind and operating it or are investigating it. So I mentioned that there are 19 countries that have already installed offshore wind and operating it, but there's a further 39 countries that are starting to investigate or have plans to install offshore wind. This is really becoming a global industry, and there's a lot of growing appetite for this technology. The majority of development to date has been around Northern Europe and in China, but as you can see, that's quickly spreading to other parts of the world. US is definitely one of the exciting countries that are coming up, particularly with all the policy announcements that have come recently. With that big opportunity that I've mentioned, coupled with the maturing of the technology, the declining costs now have become at parity with other technologies and even lower in some countries. We realized that the time was right for this to consider this for developing countries, for low and middle income countries, which we also term here as emerging markets. So in 2019, we took the step to establish this World Bank Group Offshore Wind Development Program to help developing countries to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind and build a pipeline of both bankable and sustainable offshore wind projects. And we took this approach of bringing the World Bank under the ESMAP program together with the IFC, so to cover both the public and private sector. We recognize that we have to have both elements of this to deliver offshore wind successfully. And as we've already heard from, we've also received generous support from the PROBLUE program, which has helped us to mainstream environmental and social impacts and considerations into this program. And we'll hear more from my colleague Laurie in the next presentation to hear more about the environmental and social work streams that we have. So far, we've put together a global team of about 13 people with excellent, deep experience in offshore wind, covering both environmental and social issues as well as technical issues, and also from the government side, experience in delivering offshore wind to established offshore wind markets. But we've got quite a large number of staff now engaged across the World Bank Group in the countries that we work in. And so far, we've worked with 24 countries since the program started. And that mix of countries is quite varied, ranging from small island developing states to very large economies such as India and Vietnam that have got very large growing populations, energy demand, and carbon emissions. And we feel that in many of these cases, that is where this technology is going to be developed first, developing countries, because you've got this very large power demand requirement to decarbonize. With those 24 countries, we're working with about 10 of those in earnest. Those are listed here in green. And we're working on those in a range of ways, and I'll come on to talk about that in a moment. The picture here on the right of the screen is from a study tour that we ran last year to Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, where we took 15 of the governments we work with across those countries to educate them about offshore wind and show them an offshore wind farm and all the benefits that it brings across the value chain. So just to summarize, I suppose, what we're doing at both a global and country level, this is fairly classic from a World Bank Group program of the types of activities that we can support. At a global level, we tend to provide knowledge generation and sharing of good practices from established offshore wind markets. So we're bringing all these ideas together and conveying those to our governments that we support to help them learn from the countries that have already done offshore wind, avoid the mistakes that have already been made, but yeah, learn from those good practices. Those could range from the things like the study tour that I just mentioned to things like global reports or knowledge sharing events like we are today. On a country level, that has tended to start off with offshore wind roadmaps, which are very large ranging strategic documents to look at the role of offshore wind in these countries, for the opportunity, but looking at the challenges that people are going to have to solve, and giving some recommendations on how to proceed. And that has then proceeded into enacting on those recommendations and supporting government with technical assistance, regulatory advice, but then looking to the future as to how this World Bank Group can support these countries to implement these projects, thinking about investments into infrastructure, the grid, ports, looking on the private sector side, lending potentially along to offshore wind projects, but also the supply chain and manufacturing. To give you a bit of a flavour of some of the highlights that we've had to date, so on the global side, this really started with a report called Going Global, which we released in 2019. And this started the conversation in quite a few of these countries. We covered 8 countries in that report, just looking at the opportunity that these countries had in terms of offshore wind resource. And for many countries, this was a surprise because this hadn't really been considered to that point. It was a new idea, and little was known about their offshore wind resources. And this had some really important impacts in those countries, and we recognised that. So we decided to expand that analysis to cover 115 countries. That identified over 71 terawatts of technical potential offshore wind resource across the globe. So an enormous potential, and produced a whole series of maps. There's an example here at the top right of the slide. And those maps have been very powerful. They indicate pretty clearly where the offshore wind resource is, and its magnitude and what the opportunity is for those countries. Perhaps our flagship knowledge output has been the key factors for the successful development of offshore wind in emerging markets. And this was a report that we published about 2 years ago now, and followed it up earlier this year with an e-learning course that distills a lot of that information into a very easy to digest course. But that was our attempt at bringing together all of these lessons learned from established markets and good practices that we've seen, giving lots of reference so that policymakers can use that information to make informed decisions, and back those up with references and examples. I won't touch upon the environmental and social sensitivity mapping. Laurie's going to talk about that in a moment. We're also working on something that we think is very important to deliver offshore wind, which is looking at the use of concessional financing, particularly climate finance, to bring the cost down of these projects in developing countries. And I've also mentioned the study tours that we've been running, and we'll look to run some more of those in the future. And my final slide here is just to look at some of the country impacts that we've had and the work that we've done. I mentioned the strategic country roadmaps that we've published. So there's 4 that have been published so far: for Azerbaijan, Colombia, Philippines, and Vietnam. We're also working on roadmaps for Brazil, India, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. And we'll be publishing those for Sri Lanka and Turkey in the very near future. They'll follow soon. And where we've already established roadmaps or published roadmaps, we're now working on those detailed next steps. Each of the roadmaps comes out with a whole series of recommendations as to the priorities and the actions that the government should take if they want to establish offshore wind. And those are the sort of steps we help those governments to take. And those vary really from grid planning, where we're doing that in the Philippines, to working on the sensitivity mapping that Laurie will talk about in Vietnam, to helping countries with developing their policy, their bidding frameworks and their documents for leasing. Examples of those are in India, Brazil, and Colombia. And some of the impacts here that I think we've had in the time that we've been running this program, Azerbaijan the roadmap there has really spurred a lot of interest from the private sector. There's been over 10 gigawatts of MOUs signed between the private sector developers and the government. There's a lot of interest now in developing that resource. Colombia, since the roadmap was published 2 years ago, I think it was now, last year, sorry, there's going to be a lot of private sector interest, and that has driven the government to start running its first leasing program. That resolution that outlines the leasing program came out last year. We're now working with the government on developing the bidding documents for that. India, similar story. We're helping the government with their bidding documents. There's been a target there of 30 gigawatts by 2030. That's been established for a little while. We're helping the government think through how they're going to achieve some of that capacity. The Philippines has been one of the most surprising. When we started, there was really nothing, no projects that had been planned. Now there's been over 42 gigawatts of projects that have been awarded areas. There's a huge amount of international interest in the market. Turkey, since we've been running this roadmap, haven't published it yet, but that roadmap has already helped the government to think through how they would consider offshore wind in their plans. They've already come out with a target of 5 gigawatts by 2035. And last but not least, Vietnam. We're still waiting for the Power Development Plan 8, which is the draft, but that current draft says at least 8 gigawatts of offshore by 2030. Again, when we started this program, there was really no consideration of offshore wind into their future decarbonised scenario. So I think offshore wind has now become a central part of their net zero ambition. There's a huge amount of potential in the country. So I'll stop there. I hope it gives a bit of a flavour as to what we've been up to in the programme. I have to take a few questions now. Also have to take them on chat as well. But otherwise, hand over to Laurie.
One Q&A after all.
Okay, we'll go straight to Laurie for the tape, and then we'll take some Q&A.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark, for giving us an overview of the offshore wind development at the global and country level. And to the next presenter, I will invite Laurie Anafonso, who is the Global Biodiversity Lead in IFC, Sustainability and Gender Solution Department, serves as the Lead Environmental Specialist of IFC's Scaling Wind Program in the World Bank Group Offshore Wind Development Program, which are both mainstreaming biodiversity into sectoral and landscape scale planning for the wind energy sector. Laurie specializes in the development of mitigation and management strategies to address the biodiversity-related risk and impact for the private sector development in both emerging markets and the developing countries globally. Since 2014, she has worked extensively in the wind energy sector. Laurie, over you for the next minute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcian. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you can hear me. I did see the comments from one of the listeners that the voice was going in and out. So let me know if there's that comment again. I'll try to project my voice. Okay, so we've been speaking about this already. Uniqueness of the program, the genuine mainstreaming of environmental and social aspects into an energy program, not a standalone environmental and social thing kind of over here, but actually mainstreaming into the program itself. And this bottom-up collaboration, co-creation between the World Bank and IFC, and not to mention PROBLUE providing strategic and essential funding to support the environmental and social activities in the program. So I'm going to go a little bit, just a tad here, one example of the why where we're doing this with an on-the-ground example, and then really move into the what we're doing and leading up to this. What are we actually doing with respect to environmental and social integration. Just an overview. And then finally, and how, and that's really about the resources that the human resources with whom we're working. So we already talked about this, so I think I'm going to skip the first 2 points, but really highlight the third point. Lessons learned from onshore and nearshore wind. Just give one example here just to hit this home. Now, we heard earlier from Nuru, and he mentioned Vietnam. He mentioned this very briefly. What you're looking at there is an indication. This is a map that IFC had developed some years ago, around 2020. We developed this with the Biodiversity Consultancy. And what you're seeing there is those dark red blobs going up the entire coast of Vietnam there. Those are critical habitat. Now, this is a very rapid mapping. It's not the scale of work that we're actually doing in our ESMAP program. This is something that IFC did pretty quickly. But we had enough data out there to do a very rapid mapping of critical habitats. And those, if you see those white balloons there going all up and down the coast, those were concessions that the government of Vietnam was giving out for nearshore wind. Now, when I say nearshore wind, I mean very nearshore. I'm talking 1 to 2 to 3 kilometers off the coast in the subtidal and in the intertidal zone. Now, IFC, back in the day, it was a couple of years ago, we had the potential to invest in some of these projects, and we were faced with a great deal of difficulty, and we stopped and did this mapping essentially before we invested to become more aware, not only on the project specific, but on the landscape level impacts. And I'm just going to highlight that these 2 birds, particularly the one on top, spoon-billed sandpiper. Now, this is an IUCN critically endangered species. 500 of them estimated left in the world. And that coastline of Vietnam is some of their most important wintering habitats. In fact, those red blobs there many of them are reflecting some of the last wintering habitat for the spoon-billed sandpiper, and you can see the overlapping of the white balloons of the wind farm concessions right in the same areas. So what do we do in this situation? We clearly can't figure it out one project at a time. And the other thing that we had learned is Mark had just presented the technical potential for the whole world, essentially. And that middle map there is the wind energy technical potential for Vietnam. Now, what's interesting there is you can see that dotted hashed area is where offshore wind farm development is being projected, both fixed bottom and floating. But what is interesting there is actually, if you look in the lower Mekong Delta there, you have the green and way down at the bottom of the figure I'm referring to, you see the green and yellow tones. Now, this is essentially inviolable wind potential. And that is where you have not only, you have critical habitats up and down the coast, but you have a number of projects planned in that area, in this nearshore area. So the point of this example is to say, highlighting a couple of different points that also Nora made, which is it's not only about looking at the technical potential itself, it's also looking at the environmental and social impacts, which we tried to do in these really early days, looking at these 2 things together, and then working with governments to inform good and integrated planning of the offshore wind sector. So this was kind of a wake-up call for us back in late 2019 that we need to do something here. And one of the reasons, one of the motivations for mainstreaming environmental and social considerations into the offshore wind development program. So now moving on to the what. Now, Mark had mentioned the key factors report. He mentioned the roadmaps. Also this, what we're calling SENMAP, our integrated environmental sensitivity mapping approach in country-specific activities. And I'm going to briefly go through these just and give some examples of how this mainstreaming is taking place. Firstly, at the highest level, in the key factors report, as we refer to it, that report essentially, and if you haven't seen it yet, really highly recommend that you check it out. It has been referred to now as the Bible in the offshore wind sector. I've actually heard someone say that. So there are 4 pillars: strategy, policy, frameworks, and delivery in this publication. Now, environmental and social aspects is highlighted both in the policy pillar and in the frameworks pillar. And of course, in the policy pillar, it's in the context of development of offshore wind specific policies. And there's a section on environmental and social sustainability and the role of governments. And then it's also in the frameworks pillar. And that pillar really speaks to organizing mechanisms to enable offshore wind development. And there is where we introduce the kind of one of the key areas that we're working on in this program, which is the proportionate and pragmatic marine spatial planning processes to inform the leasing of offshore wind areas. And also, of course, permitting processes where we define requirements for good international industry practice and ESIA. We also emphasize the importance of robust baseline surveys, broad stakeholder engagement, and emphasizing international environmental and social requirements. So this is just one example of this report. Might have been the Bible even without ENS, frankly. It probably would have been just as popular without it, but it's more powerful with it. And we made sure that when that publication was being developed, that it wouldn't be a side thing, it would be integrated. The environmental and social aspects would be considered just like everything else. Now, the offshore country wind roadmaps that Mark was mentioning, these capture scenarios for development. And how we integrated ENS there is that we undertook our own study to identify priority biodiversity values. The roadmaps also highlight at a higher level social concerns. And this was, the social part, I think, was a little more challenging to do because of the lack of easy to access mapping data and the type of stakeholder consultation you have to do to really garner genuine social information. But we did integrate social aspects. Definitely priority biodiversity and nature-related aspects probably receives more attention in the roadmaps we didn't publish. Now, we focused on priority biodiversity values. We defined that in this context as the key groups susceptible to impact. And what we did is we looked at those values there, legally protected areas, natural habitats, etc. And we, at a higher level, identified and screened global and spatial data, literature review, a very preliminary stakeholder engagement, and what that resulted in the roadmaps themselves is 2 consolidated spatial data layers for the country for use of the authorities there. An exclusion zone. Now, when we say exclusion, it's really being that this is so high level, it's more of a highest risk zone that might be potentially excluded. Of course, it's subject to more data that would be collected down the line. But it's a, let's say, the exclusion zone, as well as a restriction zone. And the restriction zone is definitely areas where we would need more information. But right from the get-go, I mean, you're going to the governments right away saying, here's your technical potential, here's all sorts of other factors that you need to develop to bring offshore wind to your country. And there's also these aspects that you need to be aware of: potential exclusion zone, potential restriction zone. So the messaging is right up front. And it's been very successful. We haven't seen governments at all backing away from this. In fact, it's been the opposite. It's usually open doors for more collaboration. Just some examples of what those maps look like on the biodiversity side. The right one, let's see, it's my right, maybe your left. Anyway, there's the seagrass is an example of habitats. The middle one is an example of internationally recognized areas. Those are important marine and mammal areas. And the other one on the far side is an example of species, marine turtles. And you can see there a simple approach: gather the data, map it, and show that data and project that data with respect to those black areas, which were the potential offshore wind development areas. And that is This is just 3 examples. There's a lot more of these maps in each one of the road maps. On the social side, just the example of the Philippines now, we were able to do this commercial fishing port. Commercial fishing. We were not able to go deeper than that at this level of the roadmap, but we did highlight in the text important aquaculture areas, tourism areas, historic cultural areas, and there's a heavy emphasis on the need to engage with stakeholders. But it's very important that our program is not just nature, not just biodiversity, it's also social. So this is this next piece of the presentation. Again, I'm in the what still, what we're doing. There was the key factors, the roadmaps, and now I'm about to go into this other piece, this other line of work that we're doing, which is called ESMAP. The name has changed, by the way. You might have heard this before. The name has changed. What this is an integrated environmental and social sensitivity mapping for early offshore wind spatial planning. And this takes the initial work in the roadmaps to the next level, but it doesn't go as far as MSP. So that is why we call it early offshore wind spatial planning. Essentially is identifies environmental values and social values. And I'll explain on the next slide the 4 steps it takes you through. But the outcome of the sensitivity mapping is an early identification of areas where development activities might impact these sensitive environmental and social attributes. It is used, if it's undertaken by governments now, it's a product for the government itself to roll out. It would inform the identification of broad leasing areas for potential offshore wind areas to avoid as well. And it's also, if a country government was going to carry this out, it would also help scope downstream project impact, project-specific ESA assessment. It would help to develop more targeted baseline surveys, as well as give an early indication of mitigation scope, the complexity and cost. The output is a series of grid-based sensitivity maps of environmental and social, highest environmental and social attributes. Now, our ESMAP process is a 4-step process. The document, this will take the form of a document, and what you're looking there on the right side is the document structure, the introduction, the overview of the ESMAP mapping process, and the last section on moving forward. And the core of it is those 4 steps. Now, in those 4 steps, we take the reader or the user through the desk-based screening, the type of screening that they should do at the highest level, identifying what are your acceptable social environmental impacts in your country, scoring, not impacts, I misspoke, environmental and social values in your country, scoring those values through an approach to conduct sensitivity scoring. The step 2 is then to take that to a broad set of stakeholders to also inform the sensitivity scoring, also inform the collection of data. The next step is identifying gaps that would be filled through the collection of primary data. If X country cannot do that, you can simply skip that step and you'll still have your ESMAP. But for those countries that are resourced and have the capacity, we hope that they would do primary data collection to fill in the gaps. And the 4th step is on the final sensitivity scoring and mapping. We're looking at a heat map here. So much more developed than what's in the roadmap, especially with respect to social sensitivities, in which step 2, you'd really be doing a substantial stakeholder engagement. This is a countrywide map, by the way, or you can use it within a region in a country. It's not, this is way upstream now of the project itself. Now, moving forward, type of activities we plan to do in our program. First of all, publish the ESMAP. It's been a while that it has not been published, and the reason why is because it's in a very, let's say, comprehensive review. process. So our first goal is to finally publish the ESMAP. After that, funny enough, we actually already are piloting it already, which is good. It's kind of feeding it as we're piloting it before we published it, which is kind of feeding the lessons learned, which is actually turned out to be a good thing. So a couple of examples of the types of activities we're doing across the countries that Mark mentioned. So in Vietnam, we're piloting the ESMAP itself, and that's within a framework of a larger marine spatial planning. And this is all in collaboration with our World Bank regional colleagues. In Turkey, we're actually conducting an environmental and social constraints analysis for the Sea of Marmara. You might say, why the Sea of Marmara? Because that's where the country wants to focus. So for various reasons, we're focusing there, constraints in other areas. We're also developing the scope of environmental and social feasibility studies in that country as well, high level. In Colombia and Brazil, we are also presenting to the authorities the potential to do the ESMAP, and we hope they're agreeable to that. That would be for early spatial planning purposes. That would potentially inform future leasing rounds in the long term. And Philippines and Sri Lanka and India is still in development. The kind of spread of activities that we would like to do as part of this program, once the ESMAP is published, could be advice on high-level environmental and social feasibility studies on a regional scale, supporting with competitive, the structure of competitive auctions, specifically with respect to the integration of non-price criteria, and stakeholder engagement, and also benefit sharing, work that IFC is doing in Poland, which maybe we can do in other countries. My last slide here is how. Who's doing all this work? Well, we have quite a team of resources. I just wanted to quickly highlight here. I lead this work on the environmental and social side. We have 2 core environmental and social specialists. Both are on the line, Colonel Skirt and Matt Davies. We have a firm contract for some time now with the Biodiversity Consultancy. Peter Berson's on the line. He will be presenting in a bit. And Claire Fletcher is also core to that team and the lead author on the ESMAP. We also have support specialists, Jennifer Haruza, Gabby Factor is with the Danish Institute of Human Rights. Michelle Caseda da Silva is also on the line, will be presenting, MSP specialist. And we have many reviewers from the Environmental and Natural Resources Blue Economy Department. We have the OPSCS and World Bank side, and IFC that's reviewing our work. And of course, we interface with the co-leads, the technical co-leads of this program, which is really key. So with that, thank you for listening, and maybe we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Lori, for answering our question on why, how, and what in ensuring sustainable offshore wind development. And before we go to our next question, we want to welcome any question in the room. We'll take one question, and then for those who are actually joining us, I hope you have all the questions on the chat, and Julian will highlighting 2 or 3 of them so that you have the speaker to respond and that. Okay, I'll take 2 questions. So I'll go with the first.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question was around, there are existing programs in different countries in place. For example, I saw Barbados on the list, and there's the whole debt to nature swap that was done last year. So how you integrate, is there any thought in like looking at existing programs, or is it starting from scratch and these are all different silos? I was curious about that.
I didn't get the point on other programs that are like, sorry.
So different countries have like different programs on biodiversity that they're already exploring. And so this is again coming from the offshore wind perspective, but I'm curious how those programs are being, approached or integrated. Are they being leveraged, or are these all different silos? Like, is that a way to essentially accelerate and get more going?
It absolutely is, and it's getting data and information is probably one of the hardest things to do in the countries that we're working with. So any program that is already working on this, particularly in the coastal marine environment, they're an important stakeholder that we start to talk with as part of these discussions because they have better insights than any because they've already got a head start. So yes, basically not starting from nothing.
Maybe I'll just say with respect to if we're going to start, let's say, a ESMAP program in the offshore wind or in the marine space, one of the first things we do is identify who is the ENB specialist working in that country. And usually this work is through World Bank regional colleagues. So Barbados was super early days, so we haven't quite done that yet. So if you have something on Barbados, let us know. But we're always doing this work, but often, let's say we're doing this work through World Bank regional colleagues. So we're, leveraging each other.
And the last question.
Yeah, excuse me. A couple of years ago, I looked at the ENF's guidelines, industry guidelines for renewable energies. That's been a kind of a mainstay of environmental and social management for the different industries. And there was, for renewable energies, there was almost nothing at that point. I guess the publication date might have been 10 years ago. But I'm just wondering if there's a plan afoot to add more detail, to those guidelines, the industry guidelines, and maybe expand, maybe create one just for offshore wind.
For sure. You're talking about, just to be clear, you're talking about the World Bank Group environmental and social guidelines, correct?
The industry guidelines.
So EHS, environmental health and safety industry guidelines, right?
That's
the correct term.
The ones that are sort of
yes.
the more detail per industry for the performance standards.
Yep. Yeah, so those EHS guidelines, actually for wind energy, believe it or not, it's one of the more updated ones. We updated it in 2015. We overhauled it in 2015. It's still pretty relevant, I'd say, for onshore wind. It's actually not bad still, held up for onshore wind. Yeah. For offshore wind, it's, sorry to say, way off.
Yeah. That's the one that's like 100 words.
Way off. Yeah. So it most definitely. And because there's also, most people, it's a misnomer that, it's onshore wind, I'm just going to do the same thing for offshore wind. It's a completely different sector. There's really not much in common at all between onshore and offshore wind, besides you have turbines. You're using wind energy. So I wonder if that should actually be its own guideline, but I agree, it definitely needs one. I don't know, there's no plan right now to do it. It's a great question.
Any question from our audience?
There's a question on the wind resource mapping that Mark presented globally and Laurie presented for Vietnam. And the question is, is based on models and this is validated by site measurements.
So the data that I presented on the slide was from the Global Wind Atlas, which is a freely available online resource. It is validated to some degree in certain countries where they've got access to measurements. But we appreciate that that's not always going to be completely accurate. There's always going to be some uncertainty when you get into the offshore or coastal environment. So one of the things that we do regularly is start to look at the resource, try to bring in other measurements if they're available, to just try and do a bit of that validation work or at least some calibration. But often there aren't offshore measurements that are available because this is brand new. There are maybe some coastal measurements. So in some countries like Sri Lanka, we've had access to some coastal net mass data, as well as off the coast of India. Dr. Gomes, I see you raised that question. I know that was your project with the net mast on Danesh Kodi. So that was helpful as a measurement location to help validate some of these models. And that's something we'd like to see in many of the countries that we're working with, because getting the certainty on wind resources is pretty important to encourage investment.
Thanks, Mark. Second question was on, given the capex, we talked about $3 billion for megawatts offshore wind. The question is, wouldn't it be better to develop offshore wind as a multi-purpose project. And taking the example of the hydro, where irrigation, flood control, power generation, and tourism can all be involved, is there any possibility to have a similar approach for offshore?
So I can take that one again. This is an evolving point that we're starting to see being picked up in established markets where we've got new ideas like aquaculture, mariculture, and floating solar being integrated into projects. It's being done at the pilot scale at the moment, just because this is a new approach, and I think developers are often risk averse in some ways, and that this is a new thing that they're having to work out how they're going to manage operations and maintenance of these additional components to their projects. But given that this is happening already, hopefully by the time we get to working on these projects in developing countries, it will be the right time to consider those for the countries that we're supporting.
Thanks, Mark. The last question, I'm not very familiar with all the acronyms, so we just discussed the EHS guidelines, but the question is there any updating of the IFC PS?
Yep.
I'm not too sure what
The
PS stands for here, for offshore wind, for the offshore wind program, or any supplements to come in the future.
Yes, thank you to the person who made that. So the IFC Environmental and Social Performance Standards it's referring to. There will be an update of the performance standards. There has been no date set, but it's in, let's say, the very, very early days. But eventually it will be updated. As far as integrating, as far as other guidance documents for offshore wind, there are a load of guidance documents already out there. ESIA documents for offshore wind. I think what's missing is documents that scale to the emerging markets. And the reason why it's missing is because there really are, except for China, of course, there really are, and maybe Taiwan, a handful, maybe other examples, there really isn't any offshore wind yet in emerging markets. So it's a type of technology where it's going to be interesting. Actually, we'll be inventing the practice. We'll be scaling ourselves. So right now, it's unlike when we developed the performance standards for every other sector. We already had something called good international industry practice, which is different from best practice, right? That's a different thing. There's best practice, cutting edge, leading edge practice, and then you have good international industry practice. For offshore wind, it's not quite like that. We have best and leading practice in all the markets in which it's being rolled out. We don't really have that, okay, well, what's the next level? And that's a place where we'll be collectively working as a community right now to get that straight. So no plans right now that I know that our program would release something like that. I think we'll be collecting a lot of experience though in the coming years.
Just a question on, not so much on the guidance, but the comment you made about limited offshore wind in emerging markets. Is that because outside China and Taiwan, you mentioned that because the governments are not interested, or there's ample space still in onshore wind that is not really a technology that developers and governments have seen as viable yet?
I mean, I can think that. I mean, it's been, when Mark talked about the Going Global report that we released in 2019, and at that point, I mean, there was in emerging markets, not many folks had actually really asked the question as to whether or not offshore wind would be a viable part of their energy mix. And I think that the maps that we published through that report and just profiling some of the opportunities in places like Vietnam, Philippines, Brazil, it was really the first time that we said this is a resource and there's good reasons to pursue it. And that started the conversation that has now led to the roadmaps. So I think that triggered things, and now the roadmaps have come out. Now we're starting to get into the details. But with offshore wind development, the devil is in the details, and the key factors report lays out kind of all the building blocks that have to be there to build offshore wind. But it's really hard to do. It's not like, so we've done a lot of work like in solar. Solar is relatively easy to do. It's execution in onshore solar. Offshore wind is the complexity and all the conditions that have to be in place to allow it to thrive. They take a while to develop. So I think the interest is there, the motivation is there. Most countries, you know, in places like Vietnam, they're saying like this is become a huge part of our. It's one of the best options we've got. But it takes a while to build up all those building blocks to get to the point where you've got bankable.
And the studies have been done. I mean, I know that wind has more sort of wind blows at night, so you get more electricity from wind and solar. Is it also the case offshore wind and onshore wind that you get those blades, with higher capacity because they're just on the sea? And I'm thinking, given that capex is so high now, so one way to account for that is that you have a higher utility plans.
Yeah, I mean, so Mark had touched on this. I mean, the what's called the capacity factor, so the utilization of the plant for offshore wind tends to be higher. For an onshore wind plant, you're looking at 35%, maybe 40% capacity factor. For an offshore plant, it's not unusual to get 50 to 60%. And what's interesting about it is that the winds tend to be much steadier, and so there's actually it's the IEA that started calling it variable baseload, which sounds like an odd term, but it's essentially it is variable, but it doesn't fluctuate nearly as much as onshore resources do. So when like a place like Brazil is interesting because they're looking at offshore wind as a way of offsetting interannual variability of hydro, which has become a problem. And offshore wind from one year to the next actually tends to be pretty constant. So it's really, you've got to look at it at different timescales on a daily, monthly, and an annual basis. And yeah, it can really complement other sources as well, particularly onshore wind, solar, and hydro. So,
maybe just a point of clarity on what I mentioned for Vietnam. When I said nearshore wind, that's not offshore wind technology. The only reason why the government of Vietnam was able to do that is because they're using literally like onshore turbines and like pushing them right off the coast. So that's not what we're talking about here. When it's something else. That's why local developers are able to do those projects. When we start moving into where we want to be now at Vietnam, which is kind of real offshore wind way farther out, that's really going to be pretty sophisticated, high capacity developers to do.
Thank you so much. As we keep the conversation going on, we'll move to one next question. This will be a little bit different from the first one. We have a panel discussion, a hybrid panel discussion, and this session will be led by Jackie Eldon. She is the Senior Blue Economy Consultant in Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy Global Practice in the World Bank, working primarily with the PROBLUE. She has a background in developing blue economy programs, fisheries, marine policy, as well as marine protected area management and integrated coastal management. She has worked extensively in South Asia and Pacific, Australia, and Africa. Welcome, Jackie. She'll be sharing the next panel discussion as we discuss integration of the spatial planning in the offshore wind development. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you, Mercy. Thanks so much, John. So hopefully I can project my voice a bit higher. Most people say I have a soft voice. Please let me know if I'm not projecting well enough. So this panel, we have 4 experts on marine spatial planning and offshore wind. We've got Michelle Caseta de Silva from IOC UNESCO, who's been supporting, as Mark said, some of the work that's been done on the marine spatial planning for offshore wind. We have Luanita Sinman van der Walt, who's an environmental geospatial scientist with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. She's remote. We've got Peter Burston, Senior Strategic Director and Director of Renewables, the Biodiversity Consultant Group, which Mark also introduced. And we've got John Bigala, the Vice President of Federal Policy, Business Network for Offshore Wind, and he's joining me here today. So welcome, everyone. So this panel is not so much presentations, but more question and answer, and hopefully that'll stimulate some discussion. And we'll go to Michelle first. Michelle, you've been working in this space, this marine spatial planning space, for many years now, and you know, you're one of the early sort of implementers of marine spatial planning through the UNESCO approach. And so what is the difference, you know, about offshore wind sector from other sectors in this marine spatial planning framework? And do the same approaches apply that you use in that broad marine spatial planning where you've got multiple sectors? Or are there specificities about the sector that need to be accounted for in marine spatial planning? Over to you, Michelle.
Hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. And well, first I'd like to thank you, the organizers for the invitation to this Blue Academy. I was really glad to hear in the opening that the World Bank Group as a whole considers MSP as their process to leverage the transition to the sustainable blue economy. As Laurie said, I advised the World Bank in the initial work, I would say, of the ESMAP, a work that is still ongoing. And my role was mainly to align to show how the offshore wind spatial planning could align with the good practice of such broader political process, I would say, that MSP is. And what I think the key difference in relation to offshore wind in relation to the other maritime sectors is that offshore wind is an emerging sector, and it has the potential to do different, because we are in a moment of many calls. We are in a moment where people are calling for a more integrated approach. We are in a moment that we are calling for a climate action, for sustainable blue economy, for social justice. So, and the development of any sector, there's a call for that to be more sustainable. So and this starts with in the planning process. And this starts in the planning of the sector as a whole, not only at the project level. So this starts with a more strategic overview of the use of the maritime space. So I think in this sense, MSP brings this holistic approach and can inspire sectoral planning, in the sense that it can be bring good practice related to participation, to the recognition of other sectors, of the interest of other sectors, of coastal communities, of environmental considerations. And it can bring, as well, as it was mentioned in the opening, cumulative impacts, not only of the offshore wind sector as a whole, but also take into consideration the other sectors that are occurring in the same planning area. And regarding the specificities, I think that every sector has its spatial requirements and demands, and not only offshore, but also by the coast, and as it was already highlighted, the whole offshore wind system, what in MSP we call land-sea interactions. So take these into consideration. It's another, let's say, MSP approach that the offshore wind spatial planning can also consider. And the last part of the question, did I miss something?
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Michelle. Okay. So the next question is to Anita, who's a colleague from South Africa. So Anita, your institution is specialized in providing geospatial data and has led to the planning of onshore renewable energy development zones. What are the limitations you envisage with respect to offshore wind planning in South Africa? And do you see any opportunities for that? We've sort of been teased by Laurie and Mark, but perhaps you can give us a bit more information about that. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon from a lovely sunny autumn day in Cape Town. Yes, so that's correct. We at CSIR have conducted quite a few strategic environmental assessments for large-scale sustainable development projects in South Africa. And one of those was for onshore wind and solar PV development. And that was driven by several factors, but mainly the launch of a program to procure electricity from independent power producers to augment our national utilities' ability to secure renewable energy capacity at the onset of rolling blackouts in 2008. And it's 15 years later, and things are unfortunately much worse at this stage. But that early IPP program was widely regarded as successful, but it unfortunately led to some uncoordinated and spatially suboptimal development. And in reaction to that, the national government commissioned a strategic environmental assessment to identify these renewable energy development zones, REDs, which would identify areas that are most suited for large-scale renewable energy development, which pre-screened environmental sensitivities and environmental impacts, and provided an opportunity to streamline environmental authorization processes within those areas. So it was adopted by law. The outputs are being implemented by decision makers and industry and assessment practitioners. Those SEAs are considered as a success, but they were still undertaken in a reaction to undesirable spatial rollout of the onshore renewable energy industry. And so with the offshore industry, we really have an opportunity to be truly proactive and avoid that early kind of sprawling and uncoordinated development of the sector. However, the challenge is political acknowledgement and prioritization of the industry that's needed to drive this proactive planning. So, for example, recently there have been several marine spatial plan sector plans published in South Africa, and offshore renewable energy development is hardly mentioned. It's briefly referred to in the biodiversity sector plan. And when questioning that, the response was that there's no governmental intention at this stage to develop offshore wind in South Africa, or no prioritization thereof at least. And so the limited political intention and support means that there is no rationale to develop a detailed spatial plan for this industry at this stage. But, we've seen interest from industry, and we are pretty certain that this will move forward regardless of political support. And so, we need to try and position ourselves to be able to reactively plan for the offshore industry and learn from what we missed out on with the onshore rollout. But this is really up to that political will and drive to kickstart things. That balance of early political support is probably the biggest challenge at this stage. Thank you.
Anita, and I'm sure pretty challenging for some of us in the room to get offshore wind in South Africa, given it was on the list. So anyway, but our next discussant is Peter Burston. He's, as I said, the Director of Renewables, the Biodiversity Consultant, and I think one of the architects of the ESMAP. So Peter, can you tell us more about ESMAP? Why is it needed? What is unique about it? And what are the main steps?
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all there. And thank you for, I think, 4 questions in one. So luckily, I have the benefit of Mark, and thank you, Mark and Laurie, for providing such a great introduction and overview of the work that we've been doing with the World Bank over the last 2 or 3 years. So integrating environmental and social aspects into the key factors report, all the work on the country roadmaps, and indeed ESMAP. So, I mean, Laurie gave a brief introduction of the 4 steps that are involved. I mean, overall, it is designed to be an integrated and flexible approach to sensitivity mapping. It's designed for the use, as Laurie said, to inform at a very early stage the identification of potentially broad leasing areas that have potentially the lowest environmental and social sensitivities, and by having identified where the highest areas of environmental and social sensitivities are. In addition to that, it can then, by having identified what the key priorities are with that stakeholder engagement, early stakeholder engagement, that then can feed into scoping of ESIA baseline surveys, identify what those the risks are, what types of mitigation might be required, some of the complexities around the mitigation, and the cost. And then if the country engages in a more longer term and complex MSC initiative, then the process is designed to integrate and to inform and complement that activity. So why is it needed? I think Laurie touched on this as well. I think some of the slides that Mark showed as well about the sheer scale of the offshore wind commitment and the speed of implementation, rapidly moving towards leasing rounds where potentially environmental and social risks haven't been taken into account. It's likely in those circumstances that developments will be identified in areas of higher risk where just a standard ESHA process is unlikely to manage those risks, and then we risk undermining a lot of the benefits from offshore wind. So locating them in areas of carbon sequestration obviously reduces their carbon benefits. It risks delay in the process and potentially increasing cost of finance having to deal with these risks. So in response, I think the sort of how it was kind of conceptualized was, given that MSP takes a long time, a lot of resource to implement, it needs this kind of like first very early stage of pragmatic, proportional, sector-specific approach, something that can be implemented quite quickly, but at the same time based as much as possible on existing data. And I don't know if you can remember back to the slide that Laurie showed with the 4 steps. The first step is very much looking at what existing information is out there. I think it's often cited that the lack of information is one of the kind of barriers to undertaking spatial planning and identifying risks, especially in emerging markets. But actually, it's surprising what information is available. So there's some comprehensive global data sets available. There's also more regional data sets. Obviously, there's data sets around protected areas, key biodiversity areas, data sets that have had kind of broad stakeholder inputs on, so consensus around what the most important marine mammal areas are, for example, EBSAs, underpinned by global conventions, plus some very good habitat information for certain habitats, so like coral reefs, seagrass, mangroves. There's actually very high spatial resolution data available in many countries, and then species, certainly for maybe some of the more studied species groups like birds and marine mammals, but those are the ones that we know are more sensitive to offshore wind. So the first step is very much about gathering all of that information together, validating the quality of it, the coverage, that type of thing. What can actually be incorporated into a spatial data set on GIS. And then the step that I really want to emphasize, I already touched on it earlier, but then the importance of stakeholder engagement. So with biodiversity data, there's a lot of biodiversity data often held by local knowledge holders, by experts in countries or from international data holders that isn't necessarily available, just available on the internet, but through stakeholder engagement can be validated. But it's also really important to get that stakeholder expert validation of the data that was collated in the first step. And then when we get on to social aspects, then it's even more important, the co-generation of data around, whilst the data available for social aspects, for things like tourism, for fisheries, that may be more sort of available, when it comes to maybe, more parts of the communities that are underrepresented or gender discriminated, then that co-generation is absolutely essential. So that validation of data, but also then that's where you can then identify gaps in that data or data that needs, maybe it's areas of specific aspects or sort of just coverage. Then once those gaps are identified, the third step is moving on to primary data collection. Before, which is obviously potentially the longer and trickier part, going out and actually collecting wide data across a wide sea area potentially. But then once that is captured, then coming back to the final step of integrating that new data into the spatial data set and applying a sensitivity scoring framework that can generate the maps that can be used. So that's much easier to explain when there's a slide showing it, but hopefully you can remember that from Nori's presentation earlier and give a little bit of more of a refresher on that. I don't know if I answered all 4 of your questions now.
Yes, very well. Thank you, Peter. It was very well answered. So our fourth speaker is John Bigala, who is with the Business Network for Offshore Wind. John, in many of the places in which the World Bank Group is working, the regulatory frameworks for offshore wind development are nascent or non-existent. The data is extremely limited, and we've been hearing that in many places there's limited capacity and they are often under-resourced. So what lessons learned from the US might be applicable in this context?
It's a good question, Jackie. I appreciate it. And obviously, a huge thanks to the World Bank Group for inviting us here to speak and participate in this event. And we're really glad that you all are pushing ahead to kind of expand the opportunity for offshore wind to some developing countries. I think it's important for me to clarify, I'm not a marine spatial planning expert. We're more of a participant. We're a 501c3 organization here in the US. We're seeking to build out the supply chain for offshore wind, to support that supply chain. And we've had a lot of lessons learned here. I think one of the biggest, and Peter mentioned this earlier, is having a robust stakeholder engagement process. And what that needs to look like is engaging communities early, making sure that every community that's going to be impacted by the development of offshore wind has a seat at the table, but also has a clear understanding of the timelines. These are very long lead timeline projects. Sometimes folks have a misconception that, if we're talking about the development of offshore wind, it'll be here tomorrow. It's really important that folks understand the timeline of the project and that there will be differing impacts throughout different portions of the project. The surveying timeline is going to be a little bit different. The impacts from surveying are going to be different from the impacts from construction, which are more restrictive and require more of a safety zone versus operations and maintenance, which generally speaking allows for more interaction with fishermen and other marine users. And I think it's also important to recognize that within the fishing community specifically, there are very different needs and different impacts. So longline fishermen are going to have a different impact from an offshore wind farm versus someone running trawling gear versus someone who's a more recreational sport fish, single line angler. Those tend to be far more compatible with an offshore wind farm. And in fact, here in the US, We only currently have 7 turbines operational. However, off of both Block Island and Virginia, the recreational and sport fishing industries have really seen an incredible benefit. There's a lot of activity, fish activity around these turbines. They are effectively artificial reefs. And in fact, there are a lot of developers, as I mentioned earlier, that in Europe, that are really looking to ensure that we maximize the environmental potential and the biodiversity that can coexist with these projects. So those are kind of the key early learnings, although I should also mention one of the other important lessons that we've learned from Europe and are beginning to apply here in the US is this idea of coordinated transmission planning. So, you know, if you can build out multiple projects that can share a single transmission point, a single interconnection point onto the land, you're now reducing the amount of beach impacts that you have. You're reducing the amount of multiple lines. We call it radial versus integrated transmission. So that's another really important lesson that we've learned as the U.S. has developed. And we're only about 10 years into the development of offshore wind, but we're really at an inflection point here in the U.S. with our first commercial projects being built out this summer off of Long Island and off of Massachusetts. And with an administration that has really paid a lot of attention to offshore wind. And I'd say that on the stakeholder engagement process, one of the most important changes that we've seen is the incorporation of what we call NCOS. It's a marine spatial planning tool. It integrates all, I think it's 36 or 40 different data sets overlaid onto one single map with 10-acre cells of OCS. So you can get down with incredible granularity, whether it's environmental data for marine mammal activity, bird activity, or of course, wind activity, currents, ocean currents, but then also vessel traffic. But in order to do that, you do have to have robust data. You have to have log data from the vessels. You have to have meta-ocean data from the buoys out at sea. But once you can integrate all those together, it provides a lot more transparency into the process and a lot more confidence with those stakeholders who may be impacted and may have concerns about the process.
Okay. Well, you've actually sort of answered much of the second question, so I might just finish the second question.
Sure.
And you've mentioned that stakeholder engagement is really important, but have you found that it's reduced the risk around the issues or the objections to development in different phases of the project?
It's a good question. I would say we've had varying impacts along the course of the U.S.'s development of offshore wind. Early in the process, we're still figuring out the stakeholder engagement process. There are still fishing groups that are lodging legal complaints against some offshore wind farms. However, as the industry is moving into the Gulf of Mexico, for example, perfect example, there will be an auction later this summer, hopefully late summer, early fall. We've actually had a number of fishing groups speaking out in favor of these offshore wind farms, but that's in large part because they were engaged very early in the process and regularly with BOEM. The other change that the U.S. has adopted is the incorporation of this concept of bidding credits. So as the developer is looking to lease OCS to develop the wind farm, they're paying the Treasury, let's say $100 million for that access. The federal government has now introduced the concept of, well, if you will commit to spending 80% of that of your bidding credit, then you can use that money for other uses, such as supply chain development, workforce development, but critically, community impact offsets. So that can look like community benefit agreements for tribal communities. It can look like fishing mitigation offsets for loss of gear, damages, and other costs incurred as well. We found that has been an extremely successful way of getting people to the table and paying attention and more engaged and less opposed.
Okay, no, that's really interesting, especially this idea of the credits. Very interesting. So we'll go back to Michelle for another question. Moving forward, is there any single piece of advice, like a must-have, you really have to have it, for spatial planning for the offshore wind sector in emerging markets? And what would that be? What do you see as the key sort of must-have in the marine spatial planning for offshore wind?
So it's difficult to select one advice, but I will try. At what we call emerging markets, these countries, many of them, they probably don't have MSP in place yet. But there's a high chance that they do have some ongoing MSP discussions, some pre-planning phase about how to adopt MSP. And I'm saying that because at UNESCO, we try to monitor the status of MSP around the world. And we know that about 100 countries are now discussing MSP. So I think an important advice for those dealing with spatial planning of offshore wind is try to engage with the authorities that are leading the discussion on MSP to try to align as early as possible the spatial planning of offshore wind with an emerging MSP process if this is not in place yet. Another thing to take into account is that maybe MSP is not in place, but there is integrated coastal zone management, that in some countries it goes up to 12 nautical miles, which is a lot. So there are other ongoing process that the offshore wind, the authority that is supporting offshore wind can take a look and try to build the bridges and engage in this process and align the spatial planning and take into consideration, as I said before, the concerns of other sectors, the interests of other sectors, because at the end of the day, MSP is seen as the tool to avoid conflicts between the different sectors and as well with coastal communities. So this kind of alignment, I think it's really key, and I think it's would say that's my main advice.
So we'll go back to Juanita. And so Juanita, if you had one opportunity to develop a program in South Africa to support the rollout of offshore wind in your country, any program, imagine you have a magic wand and you can wave it. What would it be? What would be the thing that you would see as rolling out?
Yes, so we are fortunate and very grateful to World Bank and IFC for investing in the development of the roadmap for South Africa through the ESMAP program. And hopefully that will commence in the next couple of weeks. And this is really an excellent first step. And we're hoping that it will garner some interest among stakeholders and particularly government so that we can get that political will going. There has been a need for a strategic environmental assessment for offshore wind voiced by various stakeholders, especially in the environmental sector. And so, I would ideally want to see a fully fledged SCA conducted for offshore wind in South Africa that is endorsed by government, championed by government, preferably the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment and Mineral Resources and Energy. And ideally, it would consist of a few main elements. So firstly, a transparent and credible scientific assessment that explores the potential risks and opportunities associated with this industry. It should have a solid geodesign element, which elicits local knowledge, spatial local knowledge, spatial considerations of potential conflicts, synergies, and development priorities between those key coastal and marine space users. And this will also augment and fill some existing gaps in the spatial data, although South Africa, we do have relatively good spatial data available, especially for these initial stages of planning. That SCA should, like the onshore process, result in the identification of renewable energy development zones. And this will also provide some consistency between what has been done onshore, given the same kind of tools to the offshore developers, industry decision makers, and assessment practitioners as well. And ultimately, it should culminate in decision support tools, policy and implementation recommendations, with that good political champion to operationalize these as environmental management instruments or similar. So don't really need a magic wand in ECA of this nature as possible now. We just need the political will to drive it through. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anita. So next, over to Peter. So Peter, you've been working in emerging markets and with the World Bank Group for many years. Now, going back to the discussion between Christian and Nuru, what is new about the work being conducted in the World Bank Group offshore wind development program, at least in your view? What do you see as new and interesting?
That is an interesting question. But before I answer, what's new about it, I think it's important to acknowledge what isn't new about it, and the fact that a lot of the work is just underpinned by many years of experience, and there's many years of the application of good international practice. Aspects like the application of the mitigation hierarchy isn't new; it's been around a long time. But of course, what is new is developing it into a new sector. As Michelle said, I think we're kind of like into a new space, and the opportunity of applying it into new applications of a technology. So a lot of the experience of offshore wind obviously is from the North Sea, which is a relatively highly degraded, arguably a highly degraded marine environment already, with relatively low diversity of threatened species. Obviously, it's very important for certain biodiversity aspects, large populations of birds, for example. But we're now moving that and developing into emerging markets that have entirely different ecosystems, coral reefs, warm water coral reefs, mangroves, species like dugong that don't obviously occur in the North Sea. So it's kind of like the application of a lot of work over many years into this kind of like new application. So I think potentially one of what's really notable to me is there was the slide that Mark presented early on in terms of just the sheer number of countries that the World Bank is engaged in. And so just the scale and the ambition of the sector as a whole, of us as a global society, but the World Bank and its involvement in this, and this kind of coming into a sector at such an early stage and applying environmental and social considerations into sector planning at such an early stage, which of course is, as going back to the mitigation hierarchy and good practice, is when the avoidance step of the mitigation hierarchy is the most effective, it's the cheapest time to avoid impact. So it's about learning from what's gone before and applying it into the new environment and new system at this scale and unprecedented rollout that we might well potentially see.
Oh, no, sorry, can you repeat? Okay, so so that is the questions from the presenters. So what we'll do now is just open it up to questions from the audience. Hopefully, before we do that, I just want to thank the presenters for answering such interesting questions, and thank you for taking the time to participate in this. But hopefully the audience will have some interesting questions for us.
Thank you. We'll be taking the question in the next session. So if you have any question, let's have this conversation. But thank you so much, the panel, for giving us this experience and sharing. For our next.
So just there are a couple of questions online on financing, and I think we can discuss that later during the event. There was also a specific question on the benefits of offshore wind, and I think this is the topic of the second panel, so we will address that. Specifically on planning, there was a question to Juanita on the chat, and she responded there. Is there any specific question in the room as well on that particular panel?
I just had one. I was curious if the panel could discuss kind of the incorporation of stakeholder mapping into marine spatial planning. We're seeing in the US a lot of our challenges when it comes to consulting with indigenous communities or traditional communities is just the sheer identification of areas of interest and topics of interest as they overlap between geography with historical and cultural ties, but as well as, biodiversity, specific marine species, shellfish, fisheries, et cetera. And to provide some examples, we have right now consulting with Native American tribes on East Coast offshore wind that were forcibly relocated historically to Oklahoma. And so the identification of groups that are halfway across the continent that now have historic ties and want to be consulted about East Coast offshore wind. Similar challenge on the West Coast is if you look at the offshore wind leases in California, there's the need to consult with tribes in Washington State, interior Pacific Northwest, who culturally rely on salmon runs that could be impacted by offshore wind hundreds of miles away. And so I was just curious if the panelists had any thoughts or experiences with that notion of incorporating stakeholder mapping into marine spatial planning so that down the road, either project-specific ISHAs or even government-level consultations can know who they need to talk to so that they don't come out at the 11th hour with significant concerns or the need to be consulted.
Sure. Any other panelists wants to?
As the only U.S. representative, I can say the engagement process with tribal communities on the West Coast has been very challenging, just in that there's a huge number of them. And I think that one of the things that this has really exposed is that even within tribal communities, there are differences of opinion on whether they're supportive, opposed, concerned, and so explaining what exactly is going on, whether it's building the foundations, laying the this is all going to be floating offshore wind on the West Coast, by the way, I should clarify, laying the mooring lines and the anchors, explaining what those impacts are going to be when you're still in the pre-development phase. It is very difficult because you don't actually know what platform design the developer may pursue, and different platform designs have different anchors and different mooring systems and different cabling systems, and so it gets very complex. I don't have a good answer as to how to contact those communities and make sure that they are engaged, other than the Bureau for the U.S. is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, manages the pre-development stakeholder engagement process. They put out public notices, they have public hearings. Tribal governments are a formal member of that body. It's also open to general public participation, and that way, if there are differences of opinion, if there are groups that may not officially be on the stakeholder engagement process, they're also given an opportunity to comment. But there is no easy answer. It's a great question. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Michelle or Juanita or Peter, do you have any comments? Otherwise, I can just talk about dealing with Aboriginal communities.
Yeah, I would like to say a few things. So stakeholder mapping, it's a very important step of any marine spatial planning process. I think for a long time, we look mainly at the European MSP process as inspiration because it's the region where MSP is more advanced. And of course, for most of the EU countries, the engagement with indigenous peoples, it's not an issue. But as we are expanding the MSP concept around the world, this will be an issue in many countries. And there is a lot of guidance about engaging with indigenous peoples, but not specific about MSP. So what we realized at UNESCO and that what we will start to develop is a specific guidance on that, because there is international conventions like the ILO 69 regarding the how to approach these communities, and we need to take into consideration that it's important that they are engaged if they want. This is another question, another issue to take into consideration. And I think this concern, it's a concern that is appearing in several recent MSP discussions. I think there are really a few examples about the engagement of indigenous peoples in MSP, for instance, in Canada, in New Zealand. But we need to discuss more how to do it properly. I have heard already that we should not call indigenous peoples as stakeholders, but in many places they are right holders when you're talking about coastal territories. So there are several concerns related to indigenous peoples that we need to pay more attention in spatial planning. So it's not exactly an answer, but it's just to say that this is a concern that it's I think one of the priorities related to engagement.
Yes, Australia has dealt with this with Aboriginal communities. I was involved in planning for the Great Barrier Reef and did a lot of consultation with Aboriginal communities. And all I can tell you is you need to allocate a lot of time. A lot of time. Whatever you allocate, double or triple it. It will take that long.
Thank you so much. Let's keep this conversation going on. So let's continue asking the question on the chat, and the speakers will respond to it. Thank you so much. Thank you, President. For that. Our next session is a very exciting one because we're going to put into practice what we've had and our experience, and we'll be having a demo just to have a visualization on how to demonstrate all these aspects that we've discussed. And this will be led by Stephen Karaha. He's a senior digital energy consultant and chartered engineer at Arup with over 5 years experience delivering engineering and advisory services for clients across the renewable energy sector. Stephen's primary focus is on integration of engineering and data sciences to develop innovative digital solutions for offshore wind projects. As I give the floor to Stephen, let's all take out our phone because it's a practical now session. And over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen, so please do let me know if you can hear me okay and if you can see the screen share. So hopefully that's visible for everyone now. Is that the case? Yeah. Great. Okay. So thanks everyone for joining this session. As mentioned, my name's Stephen Carraher. I'm a senior digital energy consultant and chartered engineer at Arup. And I'm here today to talk around our digital solution Scale, which is an offshore wind spatial planning tool to support an equitable ocean economy. So I'll briefly provide an introduction to the tool. So what is Scale? So it's a levelized cost of energy and marine spatial planning tool that's used to support strategic decision making on offshore wind deployment. It is a highly data-driven solution, so it considers a massive amount of data to understand the risks and success factors for offshore wind projects and stakeholder requirements. And it also uses leading-edge digital data science and optimization techniques to bring together levelized cost of energy analysis with consideration of geospatial factors to determine the preferred locations for offshore wind deployment. We can run Scale over broad geographic areas, so everything from up to national scale, supporting governments and seabed leasing authorities with their seabed leasing processes and marine spatial planning. And we can also run Scale at a much more granular level, for instance, supporting developers with determining the optimal locations to deploy offshore wind within seabed leasing rounds and seabed leasing zones as well. The data-driven capability within Scale enables us to run thousands and thousands of scenarios in a relatively short amount of time. And this is really powerful because it enables us to generate massive insight to feed into the decision-making process. And this ultimately, we believe, leads to better decision-making in marine spatial planning. So before we jump into the interactive part of the session, I just want to provide a quick overview of Scale in terms of the context, why it was made, how it works, and where it can fit into the MSP process. So we developed Scale as part of our work with the UK Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland, which are the seabed leasing authorities in the UK. This was part of the Future Offshore Wind Scenarios project, in which we were tasked with essentially looking at what might an offshore wind portfolio in the UK look like up to 2050, aligning with the UK's net zero ambitions. In terms of the research questions that we developed Scale to try and answer, it was around understanding the spatial implications for UK waters and different sea uses, considering up to 140 gigawatts worth of offshore wind deployed across the UK's marine exclusive economic zone. Understand which areas have the highest potential for deployment of offshore wind, considering a broad range of sea uses and costs. Investigating how the relative cost of deployment would vary up to 2050 under different scenarios, and also investigating the role that floating wind could play in unlocking otherwise undeployable sites, particularly in areas of deeper water where it may not be cost effective to develop conventional fixed foundation projects. Underpinning this project and aligning with much of what's been discussed today was the recognition that when we look to develop offshore wind, there is a huge range of stakeholder considerations and system actors requirements that need to be considered. The diagram here just shows a small subset of these, so very importantly, ecology and the environment. Other industries such as shipping, fishing and aviation. Electricity grids, which are increasingly constrained around the world. Governments and regulatory authorities who are developing marine spatial plans and strategies essentially to align with the requirements of all these stakeholders. Existing offshore operations, so that includes, for instance, offshore platforms, subsea cables and pipelines, and also developers who need not only to develop projects that align with all of these expectations and stakeholder requirements, but also need to develop projects that are well engineered and also critically economically successful as well. So this is why we developed Scale, to help address this, bring all of this together and try and solve some of these challenges in one simple tool. And using Scale, we were able to incorporate feedback from over 50 stakeholders to feed into the process across a broad range of these different stakeholder groups. Using Scale, we were able to run over 700 unique scenarios for the UK government, exploring different assumptions and geospatial factors. We considered different net zero pathways aligning with different ambitions of growth, so everything from 65 gigawatts worth of wind up to 140 in UK waters, and sensitivity analyses. So we ran a large number of these to address uncertainties in costs and system factors as well. So how does Scale work? Well, once we've identified an area of interest, we can subdivide the area into hexagonal cells of 2.5 kilometre diameter. For each of these cells, Scale will carry out a comprehensive levelized cost of energy analysis and also calculate the area of overlap with geospatial factors that could potentially place a constraint on the development of offshore wind. These two calculations are then combined into our deployment optimization model, which essentially scores each of the hexagonal cells in terms of its suitability for offshore wind. And then this is all brought together and the model shows us which areas are most suitable for deployment of offshore wind at different scales. So feeding into that levelized cost of energy calculation is a comprehensive life cycle cost analysis from everything from the development expenditure all the way through to decommissioning costs. We also calculate the sum of the lifetime energy generation for the project using our inbuilt energy yield assessment capability. And layered on top of all of this, we also consider temporal and time domain factors. So that can include market factors and technology learning rates, which influence how the costs of offshore wind will change over time. On the geospatial side, we can consider a huge number of factors, and here's just a subset that we considered for the Future Offshore Wind Scenarios project, and we've considered in other countries and other projects as well. So on the environmental side, we can consider protected areas, conservation zones, and key ecological and biodiversity considerations, such as seabird foraging ranges. We can also consider offshore infrastructure, so existing platforms, existing offshore infrastructure, cables and pipelines. We also have consideration for other industries such as fishing, shipping and aviation, and bring these together into the model to inform decision making. So bringing that all together in terms of what the model runs might look like in terms of an output. This is some of the output from our Future Offshore Wind Scenarios project with the UK government. So towards the left-hand side, is a levelised cost of energy heat map showing favourable areas from an LCOE perspective. Next to that, we've got what we call the soft area, which represents the areas with the highest and lowest overlap with geospatial factors and geospatial constraints. We've then got the loss function, which is essentially the balance between the levelised cost of energy and the geospatial factors, and essentially represents a proxy for which areas are most suited to offshore wind deployment. And then towards the right, we've got our deployment model output for one of our scenarios that we ran, which was set to deploy wind farms in 1 gigawatt clusters. And you can see how it's tried to deploy wind farms in the areas with the lowest loss function value, aka the most suitable for offshore wind. Built into the scale model, we also have Arup's proprietary foundation design software, and that enables us to also generate recommendations for the foundation type for each of those gigawatt clusters, taking into consider the site-specific conditions such as water depth, geological conditions, and metocean as well. This slide basically just presents an overview of where perhaps we could use scale as part of the development process for a marine spatial plan. So as part of the iterative cycle, we might start with some stakeholder engagement and information gathering to understand the context and stakeholder requirements for the plan. We can then use scale to explore and analyse a huge number of scenarios, incorporating those stakeholder requirements and the geospatial data sets that they align with. And then off the back of that, produce visualizations which show the preferred deployment locations and are really easy to interact with stakeholders and key decision makers. And that can then feed into the definition and the development of the marine spatial plan. So you can see as part of this iterative cycle, scale is quite a powerful tool for visualizing and analyzing different scenarios to inform decision making. And we found that the visualizations that we produce using scale are often well received and well understood by stakeholders and decision makers, which is fantastic. So I'd like to jump onto the interactive session now. What we're seeing on screen, and hopefully you can all see this, is our interactive demo website. This is publicly available, so if you wanted to have a go at home or in the room, you can visit scale.arup.com, and I'll be setting up a poll in a minute to interact with this. But just to give you an indication of what we're looking at, we've run the scale model for the Philippines, and the model has been set to deploy offshore wind clusters with 1 gigawatt capacity. The different colours here represent the different recommended foundation types, with navy blue representing jacket foundations, red representing monopiles, and pink representing floating foundations. Towards the left-hand side, we've got a range of levelised cost of energy drivers. So in this case, as an example, we can consider existing ports and substations in the Philippines, and also future ports and future substations. I'll set this to existing for now. We've also got a range of geospatial factors and constraints. So coastal buffer, which can sometimes be implemented to avoid visual impact and protect nearshore areas. A broad range of environmental designations, fishing areas, and also shipping lanes. Each of these geospatial considerations we can treat as hard, in which case the model will not deploy wind there, it will be totally excluded from the analysis. It can be treated as a soft constraint, in which case the model will try and balance deployment there with the levelised cost of energy. So essentially that means that it will try and avoid it unless it's a really favourable area from a levelised cost of energy perspective. Or the constraint can be ignored, in which case it will not be considered in the analysis and the wind farm can be deployed there. So for this interactive session, we're going to hopefully use Slido, and fingers crossed that this works. There's a QR code on the screen there that you may be able to interact with from your mobile phone, or alternatively, you can visit slido.com and enter the number on the screen there, which is 3572 515. And what I'd like people to do, if possible, is to rank those geospatial constraints based on the areas you're most likely to see protected from any offshore wind development. So I'll just do that myself as well and contribute that. So I'll give people a minute just to contribute the responses. So again, environmental designations is representing things like protected areas, conservation zones, fishing is high density fishing areas and aquaculture. That's great. So we've got 14 responses there. Oh, one more participant. So I'll just wait for that person to, there we go. So that's fantastic. So using the results of that analysis, we had environmental designations that came out towards the top, fishing, which came out second, coastal buffer, which was third, and shipping towards the bottom. So in line with that, what I'm going to do is set the environmental designation to a hard constraint, fishing to a soft constraint, as it was the second most important. And for now, I'm going to leave the other considerations as ignore. I'm going to click apply, and we'll see what that does in terms of what scale recommends for offshore wind clusters. So as you can see, the model has adapted the deployment locations to avoid these constrained environmental designations. And it's also tried to push the wind farms away from the fishing areas, which are considered as soft. So you can see interactively how that's altered the landscape in terms of the preferred deployment locations. So jumping back to the slides, I'd like to simulate here a bit of stakeholder feedback. So some breaking news from our team on the ground. They've been speaking to stakeholders, and basically the fishing community have stated that they think fishing areas must be protected at all costs, as many citizens depend on these areas for their livelihood. So they think the fishing is an absolute priority, whereas the shipping community have said that they're very confident that they can chart new shipping paths in and around new wind farms. So in line with that stakeholder feedback and fishing being such a critical consideration for the local stakeholders, if I could just ask you again to rank the different considerations, and then we'll see what that does to the score. So I'll just give people a few seconds to try and incorporate that feedback. So that's great. So again, shipping representing the shipping lanes, and fishing representing different areas as well. There we go. So we've got 15 participants there, so that's great. So again, we had environmental designations which were coming out towards the top, and fishing areas, which were seen as very important. Shipping was towards the bottom, as was the coastal buffer. So again, I'll switch the environmental designations for hard, as it was second in the rankings this time, and the fishing areas which came top, I'll treat as hard. See what that does. So as we've changed the consideration of these different factors, you can see that offshore wind is now deployed in the coastal zones with lower presence of fishing. And it's also trying to, again, push the wind farms away from environmentally constrained areas into more open waters. So that's fantastic. So again, some more breaking news from our team on the ground. They've been engaging with the local government, who have said that a coastal buffer is absolutely critical for protecting coral reefs, mangroves, and preventing the visual impact of wind farms from affecting tourism. So they think that the coastal buffer is the main consideration. And the fishing community have changed their minds, as they've shown that local surveys have shown that the habitats created by offshore wind farms could increase fishing yields. So the fishing community is now highly supportive of new offshore wind farms in fishing areas. So again, based on this stakeholder feedback and coastal buffer being a very important consideration, if I could just ask you again to see how that changes the scores. And yeah, basically please rank these in order of preference. So just give people a couple of minutes there to participate. Key thing here being that coastal buffers can often protect some of the nearshore critical habitats as well. So in those mangrove areas and coral reefs, it'll also protect some of the more historic tourist sites from any visual impacts for the wind farms as well. Fantastic. So we've got 15 participants there. Aligned with that, what I'm now going to do is change the coastal buffer to hard as it came out top in the analysis. Environmental designations was still very high up and important, but for the purposes of this run, I'm just going to set that to ignore for now to see what impact that has on the analysis. I'm going to set fishing to ignore, and then I'm going to set shipping to hard for the purposes of this scenario. And again, you can see how that massively changes the picture in terms of the best locations to deploy offshore wind. Offshore wind's mainly deployed towards the central east side, avoiding the coastal buffer, so it's further away from shore, and also avoiding the shipping lanes as well where possible. So as I said, you can visit scale.arup.com and have a play around with some of these scenarios yourselves if you're interested in doing so. And hopefully that provides a bit of an interactive demonstration of how we could use scale to support the decision-making process for marine spatial planning and integrate stakeholder feedback and considerations into that process as well. If you're interested in finding out more about our work with the UK government and the future offshore wind scenarios, you can visit futureoffshorewindscenarios.co.uk, where again there is another dashboard that's interactive that you can have a go of, or alternatively, yeah, you can visit scale.arup.com. And please also feel free to email me at stephen.carraher@arup.com if you'd like to engage in any further discussions. So with that, I'll open the floor up to any questions. I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but I'll answer those if we do have some time.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that interactive tool. I'm sure we're going to get feedback from the virtual audience and whether they're going to apply this and how the session was, especially using the tool with the practical mapping and the stakeholder issue that we've been having. So thank you so much. And we are moving forward, having this conversation going on. I'm sure there will be people feedback on the same. So thank you so much. Due to time, we'll move to our last session. This is a panel discussion on an offshore wind benefit, impact, and mitigation. And this session will be led by Sean Whitaker, the principal industry specialist in IFC. He's a professional engineer and a principal renewable energy specialist. His work focuses on IFC investment in wind farm, as well as upstream work on scaling wind and as an ESMAP IFC offshore wind development program. Prior joining the IFC, he has spent 6 years as the vice president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association. He has also worked as a senior energy consultant with ICF and spent 5 years in Madagascar designing, building, and installing windmills for rural irrigation projects. Thank you, Sean, for leading this, the last panel discussion. And I know with all this, it will be exciting last panel discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Amai, and yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm particularly happy that I got an excuse to wear my tie that has little sharks on it. I'm not sure if you can see this, but my daughter is a big fan of sharks, and she was very happy that I was able to wear this today. Very topical. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I co-lead the ESMAP IFC Offshore Wind Development Program with Mark. And today we're going to be talking, or in this last panel, we're going to be talking about offshore wind benefits, impacts, and mitigation. And we're very, very pleased to have 3 distinguished panelists joining us virtually. So the first is Pernille Scoot, and the second is Roberta Cox. I'm not sure if Roberta, you got your camera on. And then we got Angus Cook. So maybe what we'll do is just do a quick round of introductions. You can introduce, just give a quick word on your background in offshore wind. Pernille, let's start out with you. I think you're on mute, Pernille.
Working. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Sean. Pleasure to be here. I'm Pernille Skyt, marine biologist by training. In the past 22 years, I've worked with environmental and social impact issues and assessments relating to the development, installation and operation of offshore wind. That has involved assessment and implementation also of mitigation measures, and it has been in both developed countries or markets and emerging markets. Thank you.
Yes, it's on.
Roberta.
Hi.
Oh, there we go. Hello.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here at such an important event. Many thanks to the organizers to the invitation. It's an honor to represent IBAMA in another World Bank event. Good morning to all. Well, my name is Roberta Cox. I'm an environment engineer. I work at IBAMA, which is Brazil's federal environment agency. I work with environmental license of power generation projects. Well, at IBAMA, we held an international workshop on the environment impacts of offshore wind in 2019 in partnership with European Union program called Sectoral Dialogues. In this workshop, we invited six countries from European Union plus the United Kingdom to speak. We also invited the Navy and Ministry of Energy. This was an important milestone for the stakeholders in Brazil. Then we prepare a term of reference to explain what needs to be included in the environment impact study. This term of reference is available on the IBAMA website, and currently we continue to study the positive and the negative impacts of offshore wind on IBAMA and contribute to regulations from other governmental sectors on offshore wind. Let's see.
And I should say that also within the world of Brazil offshore wind, Roberta is a bit of a celebrity. She is on her LinkedIn page. She publishes these ongoing maps that IBAMA produces on where all of the license applications have come in. Oh. And over the years, we started out 4 years ago with just a couple of little projects. And then it seemed every month Roberta was publishing these maps, and there was more and more wind projects that were coming in. I think you're up to 172 gigawatts or something like that of applications into IBAMA. It's just outrageous. So it's anyway. So we have Roberta as a celebrity in the world of Brazil offshore wind. So our third panelist is Angus Cook. So Angus, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm Angus Cook. I work for the British Trust for Ornithology, and we're a sort of non-governmental organisation in the UK. I've been working on sort of offshore wind issues for the past sort of 10, 15 years, particularly focusing on things like collision risk and population modelling, so trying to sort of understand the population consequences of some of the sort of predicted impacts on birds, and trying to sort of work with industry and government and other stakeholders to try and find ways of minimising that so we can meet our climate goals with minimal cost for biodiversity. And at the same time, I'm also part of the scientific committee for the Conference on Wind Energy and Wildlife, and yeah, hopefully meet some more of you in person at that this autumn. Thanks.
So we're going to just have some quick questions for the panelists, then we'll open it up to the floor. So we'll start out with Pernille. So Pernille, you in this business for a long time. You've been working in both emerging markets and in developed markets. A lot of the conversation today has been on risks and challenges. But it was interesting when John was speaking earlier, he was talking about some of the opportunities as well, and some of the benefits that come from well-designed, properly integrated projects. Could you maybe quickly talk about some of those, some of the benefits that you've seen, again, working in both developed and emerging markets?
Yes. So in my experience, when doing the right planning of the projects and the scale of the projects, actually the positive impacts and benefits can outweigh the adverse impacts. So one of the benefits that we have seen on several of the projects around the North Sea is that when you install an offshore wind farm, you heavily reduces the fishing activities, especially sort of bottom disturbing fishing activities like trawling is no longer allowed. And that will result in the wind farm area being an aggregation area for fish population. You can almost see them as areas of sanctuary for the fish populations. That means that you will have also, because you have the structures, you'll have hard bottom areas where you have development of reef structures, so artificial reefs. And that is most likely the explanation why we've seen studies where they have GPS tracked the seals, and they can see that the seals will swim around in the wind farm area, and they will go from foundation to foundation, probably for foraging. And that also happens for harbor porpoise, which is an endangered species, of course. So I think that by siting the wind farms, especially when you get far from the coast, because near shore, as Laurie mentioned, is very problematic, both in areas where you have a lot of fishing activities, but you can also have other sort of local or community interests which are harmed by being close to the shore. But getting like 20 kilometers from the shore, I think you can have a lot of benefits from offshore wind. Also, actually, for local communities, even though you're 20 kilometers from shore, you will have vessels going out there on a regular basis, of course, in the construction phase, but also in the operational phase. You'll also have activities in sort of local towns and around the ports. You'll have people working, electricians working, engineers working, people handling services like catering and accommodation for the people connected to the wind farms and so on. So I think there can, with proper planning, there can be a lot of positives around offshore wind.
Very much for today. And maybe turning to Roberta, as interest has increased in offshore wind in Brazil, and as your famous maps keep showing the extent of it, I mean, IBAMA has a long-standing experience certainly in oil and gas, And now over the past 5 years, offshore wind has really taken a prominent position. So what do you see as the particular challenges from an ENS perspective that you're facing as IBAMA? And do you have the tools that you need in order to be able to address those challenges?
Well, good question. In IBAMA, we always need more people, we always need more employees to increase our team, but it's another thing. And about your question, yes, we have a big oil and gas industry in Brazil and a lot of expertise in offshore license because of that. So the impacts that offshore wind will bring are quite similar in the installation phase without the risk associated with oil and gas. So it's a good thing. I think the impact on birds and bats is what could be considered a new impact in offshore wind. But offshore oil rigs also have birds-related environment programs because they attract birds. So we monitor some birds in oil and gas license as well. So the environment impacts are quite similar in different proportions. The activity takes place in the same environment, use support vessels, has potential conflict with fishermen, and everything we have already treated with in oil and gas license. So we know the process, we know the impacts. The gigantic size of the structures is also new. It's a little different, and will require port logistics and adaptation that will bring impacts, but not necessarily unprecedented impacts. We know these impacts to build a port. So I believe that IBAMA is prepared. One thing we always need is training. We always seek training to keep the team well and to train new team members. How you say the large number of projects we'll see at IBAMA will not be a problem because the regulations in Brazil are moving towards auctioning the marine area first, and only those who win the auction will proceed with the license. That way, IBAMA won't be overloaded, I think.
Part of a proper planning process. And again, this is the general theme. It's like you deal with these things at the front in planning, that you don't have to deal with them on the back end because you avoid a lot of the impacts. Maybe Angus, we can turn to you. You're one of the leading ornithologists specializing in interactions with between offshore wind turbines and avian species. Curious to hear your view on, like, as you see this coming wave of offshore wind moving into emerging markets, what are some of the things that you think can be done to make sure that birds and bats do not become collateral damage in this move towards using more offshore wind to mitigate the effects of climate change?
I think the first thing to do is to make sure you get the monitoring and baseline data collection right. I mean, someone said earlier that the sort of first step and cheapest step of the mitigation hierarchy is avoidance. So understanding what species are there, understanding what the likely impacts associated with those species might be. I think that's that's absolutely key. And you then start thinking about building up monitoring programs around that. So if your primary focus is sort of migrant species and birds or bats moving through during migration periods, you might want to think about different methodologies for data collection or monitoring than you would if your primary concern is around breeding seabirds, and that just reflects how the species are using the area. But also, I think it's very important to sort of not dismiss those early projects, which certainly from a European perspective have been much smaller, much closer to shore, and not dismiss them as being, oh well, it doesn't really matter what we do, we'll just sort of collect some data and worry about it later. Make sure that as part of the conditions for building those early projects, proper monitoring programs are put in place, so you can then make sure you're collecting the data that's going to be absolutely vital for the much bigger, further offshore projects that might come through later leasing rounds. So monitoring, basically.
Always data's your friend. Maybe, Pernille, kind of back to you in terms of how you see some of the transfer of ESIA practices from developed markets, and you've worked in Denmark and Western Europe a lot. How do you see, what are the which of the ESIA practices from the developed markets transfer into emerging markets? Even a place like Taiwan, where we're just starting to see the first installations. Which of those practices transfer and which of them don't?
So I actually experienced that the majority of the ESIA practices are applicable also in emerging market. Of course, with the nuances and specific differences due to culture, there are different ways of working. But based on my experience, these emerging market countries, they will require eventually, maybe not at the very first day, but soon after, they will require the same level of ESIA as we see in other countries. I think that was one thing that Angus mentioned, the importance of monitoring baseline situation, and that's actually one of the problems in the emerging markets, that we cannot undertake environmental baseline surveys to the same extent. Normally in developed markets, we would expect 2 years of surveys of, for example, birds and marine mammals to get a fairly strong baseline. But in these emerging market countries, there's often an aggressive timeline and urgency for development. There's not a sort of legal framework for taking these large environmental survey programs offshore. So Taiwan could be an example. You cannot do aerial surveys or digital surveys in Taiwan. There is also difficulties in sort of knowledge and competences around doing these surveys. For example, as I mentioned, aerial surveys of birds and marine mammals. It can be the use of different surveys, technologies like radars and GPS tracking and hydrophones. So I think that one thing is these ESIA practices, and that should be sort of knowledge shared and transferred as far as possible. But what should also be transferred and sort of building up the capability in these emerging markets is what relates to this baseline monitoring, because that is, I agree with Angus, that is very, very important. We can do almost anything if we have the data.
All the development and interest in Brazil. What are sort of the main concerns that are raised from an environmental standpoint in Brazil for this development? And touching on what Angus and Pernille were talking about, just and data acquisition at an early stage before the projects are built. Is there anything that you're doing that IBAMA is able to do for to establish those baselines before the development happens?
IBAMA don't make those. IBAMA ask for the developments give data, so it's a concern. We are concerned about impact on birds because we have little data on offshore migratory routes in Brazil. And when there is a little data, worry increase. So this is a problem. We are also concerned about conflicts of use with industrial and artisanal fishing. There are already some small movements of artisanal fishermen who are against offshore wind. So it's very important to talk to communities right now. It's important to make this dialogue. The Ministry of Environment is having meetings to define how to act in this regard. So, of course, we have concerns about marine animals because of underwater noise and in the installation phase, and because of possible electromagnetic impacts from power cables. Well, we have five species of turtles in Brazil, whales, manatees. So yes, one concern we have is with projects very close to the coast, the near shore, because in general, biodiversity is greater in shallow waters, and also because of the visual impact in tourist areas. This is a concern. I think this is our biggest concerns, and we believe that well-planned location and mitigation measures will be very important, and of course, a lot of monitoring for us to always improve the process and getting better.
Interesting, in Brazil, one of the interesting stakeholder groups that I had not really contemplated before for offshore wind are kite surfers. There's a tremendous kite surfing population, and they go up and down the coast, and for them, offshore wind is a real concern. And that's not necessarily a consideration in the UK or other places. So I think there's different groups that are kind of brought into the discussion depending on the context. Maybe I could ask a last question to Angus before we might have time for maybe a question or two from the floor. So Angus, I mean, talk to us a little bit about the role of NGOs in this space, and sort of the role that you feel that NGOs have played in development in Western Europe, and then how you see the most appropriate role for NGOs in ensuring that development of offshore wind in emerging markets follows those lessons learned and is able to build on the experience from Europe, from Western Europe. Over to you.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's different types of NGO, and I think they all play a really important role in the process. So there's organisations like ourselves at the British Trust for Ornithology and some of the other sort of research institutes who will work to provide the evidence base and provide research that will underpin the assessments and provide the evidence that's needed to support the industry as it develops. And there's other organisations like BirdLife Partners, like the Royal Society of Protection of Birds, and organisations like that who perhaps take a more critical view and take a more critical overview of the industry, and maybe seek to hold it accountable for the impacts that are projected and the decisions that are made, to make sure that everything that's done is done on the basis of the best available information, and it's done with the biodiversity in mind, and minimizing those impacts. And that's kind of how the process has worked in Western Europe to date. I think moving forward, I think there's sort of two key roles, and I think I'd distinguish between sort of NGOs, sort of that existing international NGOs are local NGOs in the countries concerned, and I think a potentially really valuable role for international NGOs is to provide that advice and take their experience to new markets and say, this is how we've done, this is what our experience is, and you provide an evidence base which people in new and emerging markets can build on. I think within the countries concerned, I think firstly, a lot of these NGOs are going to have the on the ground knowledge. They're going to have the local knowledge of the environment and the key species that might be impacted. And secondly, I think much as sort of the RSPB does in Europe or in the UK, I think they're in the position to hold organisations accountable to make sure that impacts on the environment are minimised, and sort of really make sure that we're balancing the sort of need to develop renewable energy with the need to minimise any biodiversity impacts.
Thank you. The RSPB is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, yes? Yes.
Yes.
Great. Did we have time for a couple of questions, Mark and Julia?
Here, 1 or 2 minutes here. We're gonna have
Yeah.
1 or 2 questions.
Yep. I'll go for the first one. So, a question from Carlos Silva, who's interested in the environmental considerations and impacts for subsea cable routing.
Renele, do you want to try that one?
The environmental impacts for subsea cable routes, I heard correct? Yeah. Okay. So the environmental impacts for subsea cable mainly relates to the installation phase, where the cable is laid down in the seabed, approximately 1 to 2 meters deep, and then covered. So during the installation phase, you will have sediment in the water column, and if you are close to shore, there can be a need for using a silk curtain to prevent these sediments from spreading around. There can also be places where you have stone reefs or reef structures which you either want to avoid, or you want to be very careful with how you install your cable across those areas. So you almost hand pick the stones and move them around, and put your cable down and put the stones back on the cable. Another example could be crossing areas with seagrass. That will typically mean that seagrass beds are disturbed or destroyed, and that will require replanting of seagrass. There are numerous examples of that, both in Northern Europe and in the Mediterranean, and that can fairly easily be done successfully. Around electromagnetic fields, which is another part of subsea cables, as long as the subsea cables are buried into the seabed, the electromagnetic field will be around the same level as Earth's magnetic field. But of course, for cables on the seafloor, or even for cables hanging down from floating structures, that is something that for sure will need to be studied more to understand how that impacts. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Yes. Okay, next question is from Dr. Gomes from India, who's got an interest in bird radar studies. Perhaps this is for Angus. I suppose going to the study that was published recently from the Aberdeen Bay project,
he's interested to know, does this show that there's a lower impact on birds?
Angus?
I think the way that study has been reported and presented needs really careful interpretation. So it wasn't specifically designed to detect collisions. It was designed to record the movements of birds in and around turbines. So, and it's been quite successful, and it's really helped us to understand how the birds are responding to the turbines and how they move in and around them. But it wasn't designed to record collisions. So from that point of view, I don't think we can draw any firm conclusions around the sort of likely collision rates associated with the turbines. And I think the other point about it was that it's been carried out in a wind farm where we would have expected very few collisions anyway. So I think there's a similar study happening, just getting going this summer in the Firth of Forth, which I think will be much more helpful in answering questions around collision rates.
A question here for Roberta. It's come from Michelle. Michelle is Brazilian and has got experience in Brazilian oil and gas in the past. She's interested in knowing, is the data from oil and gas licensing available for offshore wind spatial planning? And if yes, how? And if not, what are your suggestions for this to happen?
Well, yes, the oil and gas data in license process is public, so we can use this data. The Petrobras, Shell, Total, they have many data of the marine coast, the coast in Brazil, and they are interested. They have interest in give this data to government and make this MSP or bank of data to accelerate the offshore wind in Brazil. So I think everyone is collaborating.
Thank you very much, Roberta. And I think we're going to close it here and then pass it off to our closing session. Before we do, I wanted to thank Roberta, Angus, and Pernille for your wonderful insights into this topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. We are finally coming to an end. I hope it has been interesting for the audience in the room and those joining virtually. And this conversation, let it continue going on until our next session. But before we come to an end, I want to introduce Julian, and Mark will be giving the last closing conversation remarks. But before then, Julian is a senior fisheries specialist in ENB, Global Practice World Bank, and a PROBLUE Pillar 3 lead and Blue Ocean, which have sponsored and enhanced this Blue Academy to take place today. He's an agronomist specialized in fisheries management from 2003 to 2013. He has been fisheries officer in Secretariat of Indian Ocean Tuna Commission based in Seychelles. He oversaw overall Indian Ocean tuna tagging program. He's also worked with the fisheries officer at FAO of the United Nations based in Rome, and working on the US-funded Common Oceans area beyond national jurisdiction tuna project and fisheries in Somalia. I also welcome back Mark in closing remark.
Thank you very much, Amai. Let me start by thanking everyone, all the participants, all the panelists, the chairs, Amai for moderating and organizing. I think this was a very insightful event. 3 hours that flew very quickly, and as always we are not really on time, and we missing 10 minutes here, but so thanks for those who will stay a little bit longer. I'm coming from the fisheries background, and obviously I've been learning over the last 10 months now much more about offshore wind, and this is great to see that, you know, how this can integrate now into a more blue economy approach. We saw that, you know, early stakeholder engagement with all participants is critical, but also not everyone will be happy at the end of the process, and we need to mitigate these conflicts and try to be engaging as much as we can. Obviously, the fishing industry, although seems to be very sometimes difficult to change, and we have seen examples in France where, you know, fishermen have been very angry with offshore wind development, and there is a few pictures online that you can look at. But we also saw some positive examples in return from the fishing industry, showing that, you know, these wind farms can also create, you know, biodiversity spots for fishing that could be helpful here. So I think there is some interest co-location, you know, potentials for offshore wind here, which, you know, could be also studies and brought to the conversation to see how some of the conflict could be mitigated. Now we don't have a lot of time, but there was a couple of questions in the chat about, you know, now we've been talking about emerging markets, and emerging markets, I believe, includes, you know, middle-income countries as well as low-income countries. But the number of the countries that we've been looking at and the examples that we've been providing are more in the middle-income and sometimes upper middle-income countries. So there are some, how do we make it happen in these countries, and how do we make it happen in lower-income countries? Either a need for financing, and what can the bank and the IFC bring to the table in terms of financing to make this first project, this, you know, proof of concept, also viable? How do we do that concretely?
Well, we heard, I think, in the opening conversation, particularly Nuru saying that this is a difficult technology to get it right. There's a lot of risk, and it's very different from onshore wind and onshore renewables. We're at a scale that's akin to large-scale hydropower with the complexity of offshore oil and gas. That's not to say it can't happen in low-income countries. We've seen offshore oil and gas happen in low-income countries. It definitely can, but I think that's more of a longer-term opportunity. And I think the industry is still maturing. You know, we've come a long way in the last 10 years, and we're now seeing this new venture into emerging markets, to developing countries. But these are tending to be ones that are, I suppose, the upper middle income or middle income countries that are closer to Europe or China or North America. I think those are the countries that are going to be more palatable for investors to start going into. They're already stretched as it is. You know, they're across 19 countries already. There's a huge ambition to scale up just in those 19 countries, and now we're all saying, let's do more in all these other new countries. And the feedback that we've had from industry is, you know, let's try to focus a bit and try to go systematically. It's very difficult for everybody to go all at once. There's a shortage of people, skilled staff that have got experience in developing offshore wind, and they're stretched in actually deploying people to deliver these projects. And you've got to get it right. You know, you don't want to go into a new country with all the risk of a new country and get it wrong, because it's quite easy to. And I think we're cognizant of this, and I suppose we're focusing on some of the more obvious and easy opportunities, easier in terms of you've got a resource and you've got a government commitment and will to do this. I think collectively as the bank and the development community, we can provide things like technical assistance, which is what we're doing now. We've been talking about that today. And that is a big focus of our work now, because we're in many countries, we're at zero. We've got no policies, no regulations, no real framework for offshore wind. And that has to be in place before we can even think about making investments. But once that's in and we start attracting some of these international developers and supply chain to these countries, then as a community, we can look at providing public and private sector finance. I mentioned at the start about the concessional finance idea. With the first projects in any of these countries, it's going to be more expensive. It's a fact. We've seen in every new market, they're starting high. We've got all the risks. We've got no supply chain. We've got no infrastructure. It all has to start from scratch. And These projects, I think, need to be treated differently in these countries for the first projects. They're not going to be directly competitive with onshore wind or solar. And it's important not to think that they're just going to be the same price that we're getting in Northern Europe at 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour straight away. This is an aspirational thing that governments need to commit to over a long time. So I think bringing in that concessional finance will help these first projects to be lower in cost. They're still going to be more expensive probably than the onshore wind and solar projects. But there is a lot of value that offshore wind can bring. And we talked about the socioeconomic benefits that can come. We talked about the grid benefits and how that fits with the onshore wind, with solar, with hydro to decarbonize the system. So it's not just about one thing or the other, it's about how do we do it all together and how do we recognize the value this could bring to a new industry and jobs.
So it is a conversation that can start, as well as in low-income countries. Being realistic on the timeline, being realistic on what would be needed in terms of putting in place a number of policies and regulations and legislative framework, try to identify the right potential investors, securing the grid, as creating that ecosystem that can support offshore wind, starting to develop a more long-term vision and starting to engage very early on with a number of stakeholders participating in stakeholder mapping, all these exercises that make sure we don't miss anyone, that concerns and usage of all communities that are involved in the markets can take place.
I think so. It's important to consider the resource opportunity in the long-term planning. So even if it might not be the thing that a government should consider right this second for the next 10 years, they might be focusing on the basics of doing large-scale wind or large-scale solar. Once they've established that, they've got some of this investment coming into the country, you've started to reduce the risk of just large-scale variable renewable energy, then offshore wind could start to maybe come later, particularly if you're thinking on a regional scale and you've got neighboring countries that have already been doing offshore wind. You can then, as maybe a low-income country, can start to benefit from that regional approach from other countries that have come at it, but in the longer term rather than thinking in the next 5 or 10 years. But offshore wind has got a very long time scale for development. Your project planning and preparation is going to be 2 or 3 years. If you order a turbine, it's going to take 2 or 3 years to be delivered. Same with most of a lot of the supply chain. It's got a long lead time for delivery. You've got to develop ports. That takes 2 or 3 years. So you're thinking and you're adding all this together. From thinking about a project right now to actually delivering it, it's going to be 6 to 8 years probably. Could be longer depending on the bottlenecks that you find and the surprises that you will find in developing offshore wind in a new country.
And then in terms of financing, I think that the bank has a lot of opportunities here to either look at innovative financing for supporting offshore wind, but also using all the different tools and financing tools that were already in place as a group between the AFC, between the bank, the number of guarantees. So I think this is a conversation that is starting, and see how we could be more innovative on that front in supporting countries. But there have already been some discussion. You talked about concessional financing. I guess that would be both for the public and the private sector. So have there been already some conversation on this?
There have, and there's been a piece of work that we've been working on for a little while now. It's an ongoing topic, but we're hoping to publish that this summer, which is setting out the case for why we need concessional financing. Concessional finance is lower cost financing to come alongside private sector financing and other public financing to help reduce the cost of offshore wind in this case, but to catalyze this industry, because as I said, it's not about one project, it's about multiple projects investing into delivering a long-term industry. So climate finance is a good target. So places like the climate investment funds, the green climate finance, are prime for supporting this industry. It ties in very nicely with the blue economy and providing that additional benefit. So it's not just about power. So there's been quite a bit of interest in this, and it's a new thing that's got potential to bring huge benefits.
Great, thanks a lot. Now on our side, I think PROBLUE is really keen to have supported the offshore wind development program, and we're keen to potentially continue working with you. There is a strong entry point for MSP, as it was said as well here, with early, very focused, spatial planning for offshore wind, but that's as an entry point to be fully integrated with larger MSP process that ENB has been also supporting through PROBLUE. So it's a conversation that has started, but that's to be continued and to see how best we can take this collective work of the World Bank Group forward. So with this, thanks again to everyone. I think it was a great event. I personally think it was a great event. These last 3 hours have been flying very quickly. We're hoping that maybe sometime we can continue that conversation and have a bit of an update of how things have been progressing. But looking forward to engaging with you all. If there are any specific questions from participants to specific panelists or people that were present, please do send that to us, and we will channel that. We will not send all the contacts to everyone. We will share the recording and we will share the presentations with all participants, however. So thanks again, once again. Have a good lunch for those who are lunch, and good evening and good morning to some of you. Thanks.
Thank you.